Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here to welcome you back to the Vision and Justice Convening hosted by the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I know that it's been, for me, an extraordinary morning, and I want to reiterate my thanks to Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin and all those in the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study for the extraordinary work that's gone into this. This afternoon, we will be focusing on the role of culture in shaping narratives in civic space. We'll do this through a set of panels. The first one will focus on public art, the next on technology, and finally, narratives involving mass incarceration. This convening is about celebrating those who have done the work of gathering us together to consider these questions anew. And I'd like to salute the two individuals who are about to come to the stage for the extraordinary amount of work they've done in this regard. I am so honored to be able to call them friends as well as colleagues. The first is the conceptual artist Hank Willis Thomas, and the second is the associate professor of art history at Cornell, Cheryl Finley. They will speak about public art, but will ground the conversation in the celebration of the memorial that Hank Willis Thomas is doing in collaboration with Mass Design here in Boston, on Boston Commons, to celebrate and honor the lives of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, entitled The Embrace. Please join me in welcoming Hank Willis Thomas and Cheryl Finley.
Hi, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to the afternoon session. Thank you so much, Hank. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Vision and Justice. We're so happy that you're all here gathered today, and we're really delighted to continue the conversation. I wanted to begin with that monumental sculpture that you're about to embark upon, and this really monumental commission to shift the conversation, but to continue some of the themes that we've also heard about earlier today and yesterday, and to shift the conversation to think about two themes that I think run through your work quite heavily. One is the theme of humanity, and the other one is the theme of love.
Yeah, well, after seeing this morning's panel, I realized, yes, sometimes it's better just to be like, yes.
Yes.
I think a lot about how James Baldwin said that artists are the legislators of possibility and the parliamentarians of hope.
Yes.
And also the need for there to be a space for intimacy in public life. And that's something that the Astor spoke a lot about this morning, about the way, how do we reorganize and reconsider the way that we relate to public space to allow us to think about the future and helping it become our better selves.
I agree. I think the conversation about futurity is one that this work, The Embrace, evokes. And I love the way through some of the images that we've just seen of the bronze sculpture that's going to be erected on the Boston Common in the coming year, the way in which that work is one that embraces, pun intended, your own manner of working, where you take iconic gestures that we often see, for example, in iconic photographs. And you began with the medium of photography and then digitally manipulated photography. But I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit more about this monumental sculpture that you're about to embark upon and its relationship to the space where it will be and the history that it evokes.
Sure. Well, I don't think I need to tell people here that, but the Boston Common is the oldest, I think, public space, continuously used public space in the country. And it is, for many reasons, and it's been, Boston has been so central to so many moments in our country's history, from the Boston Tea Party on down through the segregation movement, but also thinking about, more importantly, related to the MLK Memorial, where this is the place where Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King fell in love, and that she lived in proximity to that park and likely walked through that park. And to think about what it means for two people, young people studying, to come together and build a relationship, to build a partnership, and the power of what it means to come together and to embrace someone, and the way in which that she was the foundation of his legacy in many ways, and carried it on for decades after he was assassinated. And and when we were kind of given this opportunity to make a proposal, for us, we didn't want to make a memorial to just two people, a monument to two people. We wanted to actually create a call to action in a way. And so this idea of a reflective work that shows and embraces kind of both a reminder to everyone who's walking there and walks inside it that they should think about the role of what it means to come together with someone. And if there's anything that impact that I would like to leave on the world, it's the impact that my grandmother had left on me and my mom, which is the power of love to overcome every obstacle.
Right, right, and it's so true in the way that you also offer in this new work the possibility of seeing oneself and seeing oneself with others in the embrace, but also through the reflectiveness of the sculpture itself. And so to be able to have something to, reflect upon, but also to see this beauty of humanity in, I think is one of the most powerful things that this new work is going to do for the Boston Common. I also like the way that it evokes, too, the history of African Americans, especially in Boston and in and around the area of the Common. Of course, Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King Jr., to whom the monumental sculpture is devoted, but to think about a larger history of people in Boston from the past, from history, but also in the present day, is something that this work will do for the city of Boston. So we're excited to see it.
Me too.
Yeah.
I hate talking about work before it exists, because it's like,
let's cross our fingers. Well, let's talk about something that does exist. So exactly 1 year ago today, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, with Bryan Stevenson, unveiled the Peace and Justice Memorial. This was designed in partnership with Mass Design Group, and also on the grounds of this amazing and beautiful and moving memorial, there's a work entitled Raise Up that you have there. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about the process of thinking and conceiving of how you would make a memorial sort of within a memorial, and the memorial that is to peace and justice, but that is very much reflective upon the legacy of slavery, the legacy, of course, of lynching, and also the present day crisis of mass incarceration. Now, I was actually there about 3 weeks ago with students from Spelman College, and we were moved to tears. One of the things that we were thinking about was not only going to the museum, which is sort of the first stop on the tour, but reflecting on the kinds of information, the sort of bombardment of information about this problem that is exhibited in the museum through historic photographs, narratives, objects, works of art, including your own, and then going to the space of the memorial itself and seeing how some of the statistics, especially those relating to lynching, are transformed into a space of reflection.
Yeah, well, I strongly believe that artists have a role to play in civic life, and that we have not been filling our shoes as much as we could, should, and must in order to live in the kind of societies we want. And I also think that civic leaders should really think of themselves as creatives, because if they're always trying to solve problems the way that they always have, I think that's, basically wind up repeating history in far too many ways. And I really think of my work in the National Memorial for Peace and Justice as part of Bryan Stevenson's artwork, because it is, a monumental artwork, both
Right.
the memorial and the museum. And as a conceptual work of art, to create and hold space for an element of our country's legacy that has been far too ignored and not acknowledged. And then having this piece that bringing artists like myself and Sanford Biggers and Titus Kaffar and many others.
Poets
and
like
working
Elizabeth Alexander, yeah?
mass design. And well, yeah, Ava DuVernay was there at the opening, but and so Sarah was there, Darren was there. Hi, everybody else who was there. But you realize, like, this is the artwork, that Bryan is like is an artist, and he's trying to find new creative ways to address issues that academics have approached in various ways, artists have approached in various ways, politicians have, but also the need. And Skip, you do it all the time with your documentaries and like telling history in a new way, and I'm incredibly inspired by that, and my interest in a lot of the work that I do as sculpture and photography is looking at historical images as a way and trying to bring history forward, to not ask people to go back and look in books to do the research, but to put elements of historical record that are overlooked into public space, into galleries and institutions, so that people have to confront it and think about the present moment in the context of the past.
Yeah, I think you do it so effectively, not only by looking to historic photographs, and we can, of course, talk about the way you grew up. You were in archives and museums. Your mother, Dr. Deborah Willis, artist and historian of photography extraordinaire, was at the Schomburg as the first head of photographs, and you grew up in those archives. So you saw images, and you've kind of culled from many collections and histories relating to African American peoples in your work. And one of the things that is really transformative is how you began working primarily with photography and in 2 dimensions, and then transform these 2-dimensional images into something 3-dimensional. And not only just a 3-dimensional sculpture, but also monuments that are placed in public spaces. And I think it's really impactful, especially when we talk about civic engagement and also responsibility. And not only responsibility for historians and artists and cultural workers, but also responsibility for people who actually go to these monuments and experience them. And I'd love to know if you could say something about the experience of some of the spaces that your works have inhabited, so that if they're, for example, in city squares, or if they're on lawns and greens in public spaces, the ways in which people have a kinesthetic experience by walking through and experiencing the monuments, I think reflects some of the passion of the work that you try to do.
Yeah, I have to acknowledge this image that's behind me, and looking at this image of both propaganda to encourage quote-unquote white women not to vote, and to very much discourage black men to vote, not to vote. And thinking about how public space and propaganda goes out into the world through advertising and magazines and various mediums that tell us who we are, what to think, and how we should navigate the world. I think my role is to remind others and myself that I am whoever I think I am. Meaning that my potential is only limited by my own creative capacity to bring what I want to imagine into the world. And as a result of that, I started to think that something that I really hold true is that I am you, something that Gordon Parks has said, that I'm each and every one of you, and that through collaboration, I can get to touch as much as I possibly can and be everywhere that I possibly can. So I've been able to, through my collaborative projects, be exhibited in airports, in museums, outside of museums, and in public sculpture parks, in all around in 5 or 6 or 7 different countries, and now with 4 Freedoms in all 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. And my ego isn't attached to my name. My ego is attached to my love. So if I can love you and you do something, I'm like, yes, I just
Yes.
did it. You know,
Yeah.
and so I have a real a joy in being a part of a small part of a community of people who are changing the world. And that's what I saw when I was watching the slides this morning. And I was like, oh, we're all here working together.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think about myself, even though I've been friends with Theaster for almost 15 years, we've never made art together.
Right.
But then I was like, wait, I guess we are working together.
Yeah.
And thinking about this collective work that we do, I feel that I am large and I
Yeah.
contain multitudes, as a great American once said.
Well, I'm speaking about collaboration. It seems to me, just after having written about your work and knowing you for much of my life too, I would say that this need to collaborate is really part of your working method. And just when you finished graduate school, you and other artists formed Cause Collective. And Cause Collective is one of the collaboratives that Hank is very actively involved in, that has, as you said, mounted exhibitions in airports along the way.
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. The Truth Booth has been all over, just about all over the world. At least that's the intention of it. And then For Freedoms, I kind of wanted to come back to that project too, just to get you to talk a little bit about it, because it was a really prescient idea that you and Eric Gottesman started you started For Freedoms at a time in that in the country here we were dealing with the midterm elections, right? And you wanted to address that with art, and you wanted to address that in a way that would make people think about what it means to participate in a civic society, what it means to have your vote counted, what it means to be able to have your say. And so I'd like for you to talk about the program, but also the references that you're making to in the title of the work.
Yeah, well, the For Freedoms 50 State Initiative. But actually, For Freedoms started at a conference that my mother, Deborah Willis, and Ellen Toscano did, Black Portraitors 2, in collaboration with Skip and the Boyce Institute at NYU in Florence, Italy. Yeah. And it was a convening much like this, so I can imagine great things being born out of this collaboration. And Eric and I were walking from one convening to one session to the next, and we're talking, is May 2015, and we were talking about the election season and what we thought might happen. So our president wasn't even running at the time, and we realized that every election, him and I tended to only speak around election season, and we would be saying, oh, so-and-so should do this, so-and-so should be doing that. And we realized that some point we need to put our skin in the game, and that by the inspiration of all the creative people we were around, that we actually should take the ideas that we have in these conferences and these convenings and put them out into the world. And so we were very much looking at an artist's work that was put out into the world as kind of a way to tell stories for patriotism, which was Norman Rockwell's FOUR Freedoms paintings, which were a representation of FDR's For Freedoms, which were freedom of speech, freedom from want, freedom of worship, and freedom from fear, which he spoke about in his 1941 State of the Union speech, and saying that everyone in the world was entitled to these 4 basic freedoms that we should be willing to fight for. And Rockwell made these paintings that showed what these human rights values were and how they were worth fighting for. And they were used to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for the war effort by the United States government. And we thought that we needed to be involved in that kind of propaganda making, so we started in organizations. FOURfreedoms.com was taken, so we thought, Eric realized that forfreedoms.com wasn't taken. And we decided that, we're For Freedoms, because if we wanted to actually be thinking forward, we had to be for freedoms that we, at this point in our lives, may not be willing to embrace or even consider. And we started off as a super PAC, and we decided that we were going to be putting critical discourse into political discourse through fine art thinking and asking artists from all over the country and in various parts of the world to create billboards with us that we eventually, in the 50-state initiative, put up in all 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. I think Bayate Ross Smith and Theaster, who are also here, did billboards with us. And then we wanted to do over 200 billboards.
Wow.
In the past few years, we've done over 100 exhibitions with artists from over 250 institutions all over the country, and did over 100 town halls, which were convenings in the spirit of this, but not as awesome, that really are centered around artist practices as a form, as an inspiration for civic discourse. So thinking about mass incarceration with artists who have been incarcerated, who are challenging how we should be affecting the criminal justice system, but as well as with politicians who are also invested. There's various projects that we've done.
It's fantastic, and it also kind of makes me think back to one of your starting points. If we were to look at, say, the work that you did when you were in graduate school, and a theme that runs through your work, this image, I am a man, and this work here that kind of comes from that iconic Ernest Withers photograph, a lot of the work and a lot of the ideas that you have espoused in your public work and also in your 2D work has had a lot to do with the ways in which Black men are represented in the media and in photography. And I wanted to ask if you could talk about some of those initial works that you did for your thesis show and the way that you kind of seamlessly put together images that were photographically manipulated and placed them in advertising kiosks, and many people thought that they were real ads, and how that transformed your working methodology going forward.
Yeah, and that also started with Eric as well. I was making images that looked like Nike ads, but Nike would probably never make those images, and wanted to really find a way, and MasterCard and Absolute, et cetera, but wanted to find a way, and here are the Four Freedoms paintings behind me. And then this is the original 5 of us who started Four Freedoms, acting as political operatives in this performance. And because, you got to believe that your own hype.
Right, right.
But I put these billboards, in the MFA show because I'm a master procrastinator. Every space in the whole exhibition was already gone. So I was like, it's fine, I'll find something to do. And we were talking about maybe I'll get like a bus stop or something. Mm-hmm. So I went to this Viacom Outdoor at the time and said, can I rent a bus stop? And they were like, it's $2,000 a day. And I was like, I can't do that. And then I saw these kiosks that they have on Market Street in San Francisco, and I was like, how about those? And the guy said they're $500 a day. And the show was 10 days. I was like, I don't have that kind of money. I was like, how about $500 for 10 days? And he's like, okay. And somehow it took, they took a crane. It was like the 3-ton, 12 or 15-foot sign, and they plopped it out in the courtyard in front of the school. And I remember watching people walk into the building and be like, this school is just getting so corporate. I can't believe Nike and Absolute are sponsoring the MFA show. And I realized that somehow by just using that language of their branding language, that I could add things into that language that they would have never intended, because there is something with our president's name means win.
Right.
And you can't, and there was for 30 years or 40 years, you saw a shiny golden sign that said Trump. The power of branding is so epic, and our willingness, it's usually a one-way conversation telling us what to buy, but I think now we need to kind of adapt that ubiquitous language, because you don't even have to speak a language to interpret the advertisements.
Right.
So how do we start to use branding as this new global language to tell different stories? And that's what kind of birthed a lot of the methodologies that we've been doing with Four Freedoms.
Yeah, and using branding and cross-branding even to be able to speak out and to transform the civic society that we want to live in. I wanted to ask you to talk about a work that I really love that has the word love in it. Many of your works have the word love in them. And this is a sculpture that was installed in 2017 in San Francisco called Love Overrules. And I'd like for you to talk about that one and tell us about this sculpture, which is one that is illuminated at night. These are just the letters, if you will, in fluorescence, illuminated at night. Love overrules. What does it mean, and why is it there? Why is it such an important site for the placement of that work?
Yeah. Well, and I see you're wearing an I Am Human shirt. I've never seen one of those in person. I designed that shirt for a documentary on Maya Angelou, and I'd never seen it in person, so that's cool. Thank you.
All right.
Everything that I can try, and you're walking around wearing a shirt that says I'm human. Often when I introduce myself to people, they say like, I say I'm a person, and often people giggle. And I realize, because that we give ourselves titles and labels that validate us, but especially as an African American man, I think if there's anything I want someone to know about me, from the second I get to speak, it's that I'm a person, that I am a human being, because all too often our humanity is not recognized,
Right.
and I feel like I have this responsibility to remind myself of that, because people are fragile, but among other things, but also to remind everyone else of that. And this need to have intimacy is something that drives a lot of what I want to do, because I think when you have intimacy with someone, it's so much harder to harm them, at least willfully, often. My cousin, Sunga Willis, was murdered, and he was shot at gunpoint during a robbery. Someone was robbing him, and he was 27 years old. We lived together. Our last argument, because he was my life plan. I was just like, I'm just going to sit behind him and I'll be fine. Soon after he was murdered, so our last argument was about, I was going to go to San Francisco to grad school. He'd always wanted to move to San Francisco. He's like, man, you always follow me. I was like, no, I'm going to go to school, blah, blah, blah. And literally 2 days later, he was murdered. And I wound up moving to San Francisco without my plan really was to follow him, but I didn't want to admit it. And so I had this, all of a sudden I was at a loss about like, who am I, what am I? And then recognizing how often, African American men, young men especially, because we were like bragging that we turned 21 without getting shot. And recognizing how many of us fall victim to violence, not only from police violence, but also because of a sense of not valuing ourselves and each other. And I found some random recording of my cousin, like on a disc that someone had, and it was the last, he was like, oh, me and your cousin, we were like messing around on a microphone, right before he died. And the last words that he said on this recording were love overrules. And it just, to me, this like, it was I felt like it was a message, not only to me, but to the world that I wanted to
It's so prescient.
put out. And it wasn't clear if it was love over rules or love over rules. Because I think he always felt frustrated with the idea, the rules. As a black man, he was an athlete, he had to play sports, but he didn't like playing sports. But he got to go to college through playing sports, and a lot of the roles that he had to play in society, he felt like he needed to do that in order to be loved. And so for me, I think a lot of what I wanted to do with that piece, which was put in San Francisco, where we were arguing about on a building that I think it's really a monument to my cousin.
It's such a powerful monument, but also so simple. The way that you use words is something that really impresses me, and I'd love it if you could say something more about that, perhaps referring to the work that just flashed a little while ago, I Am a Man, the way that you use titles and try to kind of think about different ways that certain titles
That's Zoe Buckman
might mean
for Freedom.
might mean things. Yeah,
I mean, words are there's an artist actually who did a Four Freedoms billboard that you'll see maybe named Christine Sun Kim, and it says words shape reality. The words that we choose do really create the pictures in our mind to create the world that exists, and sometimes we don't have words to describe things. We have to make them. But also there are subtle shifts in words, like all lives matter was a response to Black Lives Matters, as if Black lives weren't part of all lives. And I wanted to put out all lives matter, because a lot of times people who were saying all lives matter meant all lives matter, but some more than others.
Right.
And so there's an inherent kind of message, mixed message or hidden message in there. And so what we hope to do, so with this 50-state initiative that you see some of the younger people on our team are putting up the maps of where we're doing projects. We really do think that we need to have a much more complicated, critical public discourse, that you don't just see something and have a knee-jerk response of anger or joy, but to really, what good art does is it asks questions. And I think it was E.E. Cummings who said, always the beautiful answer, where are the beautiful questions? Where are the beautiful questions? And how do we become comfortable with not knowing the answer? Because the road to progress is always under construction. Like every time we reach a milestone, we have to recognize that we have more road ahead of us to develop than we have behind us.
Sometimes there's a roadblock.
And sometimes there's a roadblock. And so that's a lot of what I'm interested in with language and with ideas and with the collaborations, is to just put things in people's minds, in my mind, that kind of infect us with curiosity. And this is a billboard, so someone else saw that we were doing lawn signs with Four Freedoms, and then another artist approached the lawn signs from a very different way of asking people to write, I feel free. And this kind of open container of being Four Freedoms that is really, hopefully, as expansive as the human mind.
Yeah, it's really, really powerful. And these images that have been flashing, especially some of the ones of young people, not only make me reflect upon the session earlier with the two young women that was so powerful this morning, but also it made me think about you and this particular moment in your life. You're the father to a new, beautiful baby girl. And I wanted to ask, how has this new responsibility changed the way you think about the work that you do and sort of the imperative that's inherent in the work that you do, what you need to do, what needs to get out there, how quickly you might need to get work out there, and the power of the message that you want your work to have for your daughter's future?
Well, we named our daughter Zenzele, which means in Ndebele. It can be read many ways, but it's like you did it for yourself. But it could also be read as you did it to yourself. And so we gave her that name, call her Zenzi, because we want her to recognize that she has her own capacity within herself to make the world how she wants it to be. And Zenzile is the name of Miriam Makeba, who is also a major inspiration for us. And what I think a lot about, as far as my role, is patriarchy and being, a cisgendered, heteronormative, man. How do I not put too much of my own inherited baggage on her, or them, frankly, to allow them to be the person they want to be without the need to kind of check anyone else's boxes to feel loved. Because if the greatest gift that any of us is given is our consciousness and our ability to say I am, saying I am lovable, which is something that my grandmother had me say from 2 years old, is the kind of affirmation that can drive you through all kinds of storms. And so that's, and then also for her not to feel that she has to choose a side or check a box, like that. I say us is them, and they are us. That we, those people over there who I don't want to be like, probably just don't want to be like me as much as I don't want to be like them. And I'm hoping that I can just set an example of, that my mother and my father did, of recognizing that love overrules, that love for yourself can kind of break many rules, and love for your community can open countless doors. And so these are our versions of the Four Freedoms images that show, real families that have traveled across country borders and religious borders to come together and are making America great again through their love.
Beautiful. I think we're going to end it there, yeah?
Okay, thank
All
you.
right. Thank you so much.
I just want to thank Cheryl and Hank once more. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberly Drew, and I'm a writer and independent curator. And as the resident internet person in the room, I just want to encourage everyone who has a device to be live tweeting, to be posting, to be sharing, using hashtag Vision and Justice today. It's strongly encouraged that you use your phones in this room. How cool is that? After kicking off the convening, I had to pause and reflect upon what I wanted to say to everyone as I introduced our next panel. For those of us who are just joining or those who are tuning in via live stream, hi live stream. I was watching this morning. We're convening this weekend to consider the role that each of us can play in understanding the nexus of art, race, and justice. This morning, there was a stunning panel hosted by Sarah, featuring Theaster Gates and Sir David Adjaye. I'd like to paraphrase Theaster. There is what we expect government to do, but then there is also a social expectation that allows harmony. It is our belief in others. Justice requires our deep commitment. In many ways, commitment is the ethos of this weekend's convening. It is the commitment of our fearless leader, Sarah Lewis. It is the commitment of her peers here at Harvard, her students, every volunteer and programming assistant that has worked tirelessly to make this possible. The success of this conference is due to our commitment to each other, and of course, our commitment to art, race, and justice. This afternoon, I'm happy to introduce our next conversation, featuring two voices who will speak about their commitment to the Turnaround Arts Program. To quote our forever First Lady, Michelle Obama, forever and ever and ever, and the only one. Arts education isn't something we add on after we've achieved other priorities like raising test scores, and getting kids into college. It is actually critical for achieving those priorities in the first place. That's what the Turnaround Arts Program does. Today, we're joined by Damian Woetzel, the president of the Juilliard School. Mr. Woetzel has given the world so many gifts in his career as both an arts leader and as a principal dancer with the New York City Ballet, and as a dancer on stages around the globe. Since retiring from his 2-decade career as a dancer, he's worked as the artistic director of the Vail Dance Festival, and as an independent director, choreographer, and producer. Before joining Juilliard last year, Woetzel was the director of the Aspen Institute Arts Program, which aims to further the value of arts in society. Today, Mr. Woetzel is joined by the incomparable Melody C. Barnes, chair of the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions and the Opportunity Youth Forum. Barnes's illustrious resume includes co-founding MB Squared, a domestic strategy firm, and serving as a senior fellow and Compton visiting professor in world politics at UVA's Miller Center. She has also served as assistant to the president, the one that matters, and director of the White House Domestic Policy Council from 2009 to 2012. And as if that wasn't enough, in a TED Talk of hers that I found, she talks about having studied piano, violin, flute, ballet, improv, and painting. Today, she is a fierce proponent of arts education's potential to change and impact minds across the nation. Before I hand things over, I'd love to leave you with a reminder from Mr. Woetzel, who said, "Creativity is a learning tool. It's not just decorative and beautiful. It also helps you learn and understand things." And so with that, I say, happy learning, everyone. And please help me welcome Damian and Melody to the stage.
Hello. Great to be with you all, and always to be with you, Melody.
As well with you, thank you. And if I were good at any of those things, I would have had a very different career.
Well, I mean, we're going to take a little aside right now and say they didn't mention ballroom dancing, because serious business over here. You know, wow, just to hear that quote from the forever First Lady, it takes us to a place of this, you know, on one level it's pure joy. Another level, it was, you know, the pure underpinnings of work that went on during those years. And just to put people at ease, because this is a question I've heard, turnaround art still exists because in the final year of the Obama administration, it was transferred to the Kennedy Center, where it lives happily on, and we'll talk about what that means. But, you know, thinking back, I keep thinking that, you know, there was always a landscape for arts and culture in this country. There was always a landscape that we'll discuss, and we'll look at images. But walking in to 2009, there was something different going on.
Absolutely. There was a new way of thinking about the way that we were going to tackle the big challenges. I mean, I'm sure we all remember what was facing the country at that time, and we wanted to do that using every resource, every asset, the skills of every citizen to help us tackle those enormous challenges.
That's right, and I think that, you know, from an artist's point of view, so I grew up about 10 miles from here, went to an elementary school that handed you a recorder in the first grade and said, you know, this is a musical instrument, and I lived a life of incredible artistic privilege to get to try things, to constantly have the question of like trying to do something new. It was also a time that was the busing era. And so we had, in my school, students arriving from all parts of Boston who joined with us in these endeavors that were all about possibility. And that's what I keep thinking of. And the underpinnings of what we're going to talk about here were not just happy and like for the good of it all. Yes, the creative part is all about process and having a chance to think differently, to ask questions that have a resolution. But it's also about work. It's like the chance to do the hard work like Hinton talked about this morning, and the opportunity to have the framework. So I think about that a lot when I think about that period of time that, you know, there were a lot of us doing different types of artistic endeavors. Citizen artist work, we call it. Like the idea that being an artist is equated and with being a part of your society, of your community. But a lot of it was done in the face of opposition to the structure as opposed to enhanced by the structures that existed.
Right, and to put our conversation and our discussion about turnaround arts in context, we think about education. I mean, going back historically, we think about the African American story in America, that it was one of struggle, but also one of striving and one of excellence. And simultaneously, the American narrative, the American focus on education was one that was much more challenging. The policies, the practices, you think about periods where it was illegal in some places for African Americans to learn to read. You think about the fact that there were places where entire school districts were shut down to avoid African American children and white children going to school together, where resources weren't provided, there was underinvestment and certainly disinvestment, and even when we got to periods of reform, that there was such monumental resistance. And we are sitting in a place, in a city, where we can think about those images of resistance and the anger and the hostility. And so as all that was going on, we also created these narratives and these images in the psyche of America that are indelibly on our minds about what was possible, that children can't learn or won't learn or didn't deserve to learn. And all of that was in the background as we were walking into the White House in 2009 and thinking about not only an economic challenge, but the totality of that challenge that included how were we going to approach the challenges facing American education and the American education system.
Right, and I think that, you know, what was in the water right at that moment had started, you know, with the campaign, with an actual arts policy committee as a plank of the platform that I was privileged to be on, Sarah was on, and it laid out the idea that art and artists were not a decorative force, they were a productive part of society, to be subsumed and part of the onward struggle that we were all putting our shoulders to. And it validated, and it was the first time in that way that I think that had ever been done, certainly on a presidential level, in a serious way, that this actually matters, and central to that was education. And the goals were all about providing the opportunity to be a part of the solutions. And so we had that energy going into 2009, and we sort of built from there. I'm going to say this is what, you know, confronted us in some ways when we thought about where we were coming from. That it was, as Sarah also said earlier, you know, not everybody counted. Not everybody counted in anything. And when we thought about opportunity, and in terms of educational opportunity, we knew the work that was there to be done and remains to be done. And we wanted to find our way to being productive in it. Part of that, a big part of that, it seemed apparent right from the start, was who counted was who was seen. And I remember sitting in the front row in the East Room, and I snapped that photo, and I actually texted it to Sarah because I knew her work as it was developing. And the idea that this was our amazing president, full of grace, standing, giving awards for arts and humanities, was just everything about what was possible.
Right, and you look at that and you think about the arc of history and all that had happened between the man behind the man who was the 44th president of the United States, and the struggle, and this new moment of possibility and opportunity.
That's right, and so much of that in those very, very beginning years in 2009, 2010, what happened was the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities, which had existed for over 2 decades, suddenly was populated by artists. And it was a revelation, right? And we set about trying to figure out what we could do, where we could have impact. We had working groups on economic development, working groups on diplomacy, working groups on education, working groups on the idea of an artist corps. And within that time period, though, the work of celebrating all voices was going at a fever pitch. Events that celebrated our sheroes and heroes, and there's Judith Jamison being celebrated at the White House by our forever First Lady. And it wasn't just about the excellence of Judy's craft as a dancer and as a director and as a leader for this country. It was about how she was training and bringing up students. So yeah, we populated the East Room with students from all around the country to partake in what that meant to be educated and to look at someone like that and realize the possibilities that were apparent for everyone.
And understand that before, and I still call them FLOTUS and POTUS, walked into the White House, they were thinking very seriously about the role that the arts could play. They wanted to engage artists in the artist community in a fundamentally different way, that it would be performance, yes, but not just performance. What could the artists that walked into the East Wing of the White House tell us about who we are and how we celebrate ourselves and what was possible? That was fundamental from the very, very beginning.
Well, and as an artist who had that opportunity to be there, that's exactly what it felt like. And it felt like a challenge. In fact, I do remember the president when, you know, the first time we had an opportunity to meet him as a committee, he said, "Bring me something." He said, "Bring me something. You know, we know you can challenge us to do better." And you know, this next slide I subtitled, and it wasn't just kids dancing. They embodied grace in the White House in so many ways that were informative to the artistic community and for all voices to be amplified. They continued traditions of celebrating good work, but with an emphasis on community programs that developed opportunities for all voices to develop artistically. I chose a little triptych here. This is the First Lady with the new ballet ensemble. That's Brianna, who is representing the students, and Katie Smythe, who created the program in Memphis, Tennessee. I loved this photo of Brianna on the hallway, looking at the First Lady with Stevie Wonder and saying, you know, I'm here too. I have this possibility. And then this is a photo of Brianna, and the gentleman in the middle is a guy named Lil Buck, who's a dancer, who I've worked with a lot over the last decade. And Little Buck's a product of the new ballet ensemble. He came out of Memphis. He came to the White House to celebrate the program that developed him. And I loved that kind of idea that this was a celebration. And that was the background by which all the kind of work on what are we going to do was being done.
Right, and as you all were thinking through those issues, the policy staff was thinking about economic crisis and the economy almost going over a cliff. We were thinking about what to do about the financial services industry. We were thinking about all of these issues, including what the president had said. And you remember that campaign, he talked from the beginning about the importance of education. Preschool, K-12, higher education, post-secondary education, and the challenges that face the country, going back to that narrative arc that I talked about a few minutes ago. And he was saying to us, how are we going to tackle these issues? Even before we walked into the White House on that January day, January 20th, we were working during the transition to try and craft and to shape policies that would start to shift what was happening in schools across the country. So those two things were all happening at the same time.
Right, and as the time passed forward, and we've seen this image earlier today, it was intrinsic was the idea of representation, of representational justice, that this was a first family in the White House that was open, the doors were open, and young people can gaze upon them, and always will from now on, with aspiration, but a recognition of their own possibility.
Right, so the country was being now, from my perspective, pleasantly bombarded with all of these images of a new First Lady and a new president. And we've talked over the course of today and yesterday about the way, and I think Carrie Mae Weems was talking about this, the way that some of those images exacerbated friction and anger and violence in many places, but at the same time for others, for these young people and so many others, this was a chance to imagine what I could be. Mm-hmm. What could I be? And for many of them, they were the only images that they ever had. I remember introducing my godson and his little brother to the president. His little brother was 8 years old at the time. He turned to walk into the Oval Office, and the president was standing there leaning against the door, and Ryan turned the corner and he looked at him, he goes, "Oh my God." He was 8 years old. I mean, that was a sense of aspiration and possibility and opportunity rolled into those three words.
So, meanwhile, things were happening that had really, unprecedented things. This is a photo of a meeting where we unveiled for the president a landmark report on arts education. So over those first 2.5 years, we did the research was done on the state of arts education and the state of possibility that this administration could look at and try and make progress on through the arts for education. You can see Melody.
Different hair.
Standing on the side.
We can do so many things with our hair.
And shepherding this process where, I'm trying to look real serious down the end. Kerry Washington's dead center across from the president, standing there, all of us putting our shoulders to the wheel saying, we want to make a difference. We want arts to be a part of this solution.
And understand for a second, historically, art sat in the East Wing and policy sat in the West Wing, and never the twain shall meet. And the very idea, and I remember a colleague saying to me, so you've got artists working with you on education policy? It was like, Absolutely. I mean, the idea of integrating the power of these communities and all of these big brains and expertise and talent to take on what, again, I mentioned was one of the president's signature priorities, and the fact that he had also said to us, we want to focus on the 5,000 schools in the United States that were the lowest performing schools, the bottom 5%, in addition to the other work that we were doing. Those were the schools that had the most significant rates of disciplinary action taking place, and we know what that means. Those were the schools where attendance was often the lowest. Those were the schools where you had the most significant numbers of students that were dropping out, where students were reading significantly below grade level, So how were we going to work together to turn around those schools?
And the answer was what you're seeing, to some degree. There was certainly an element in some ways of Star Search. We were laughing about that. Like the idea that, you know, this was the work was going on. It was about drawing attention in that way to the important work that was being done. And the strategies that were being employed all had to do with resources, about new arts teachers, instruments, possibilities for the students to actually try, just like I was handed a recorder. But more than that, it was driven by data, it was driven by research in how these programs could develop. And it started with 8 schools around the country as pilots, and well, you'll get to the statistics, but the short answer was it proved to work. The students themselves understood something about what it meant to perform, is the way I always look at it. Culminating events were pivotal. There were ideas that there was an end game. There was a moment when you had to stand and actually deliver, and you had to be a part of something in a real sense. And my own experience in classrooms was always about the eyes in the students. When their eyes lit and they finally were able to actually engage in the possibility that they would perform, that was the moment when we knew that we were making success.
Right, and all of that was consistent. Damian mentioned the data. All of that was consistent with what we had learned, what we felt, but what we learned and knew to be true, that we were developing and supporting a whole host of skills in students that would allow them to become more proficient at reading, to attach to schools in a different way, that stickiness that would bring them there. We knew that what they would learn in arts programs not only would help them build confidence and discipline, but also could help them with math and with science. So there was the performative piece of this for them that was so important and helped to build other skills that we knew could translate into their ability not only to learn, but to attach to school and attach to education in an important way.
That's right. And it went on in different ways. This is Savoy Elementary. This is Orchard Gardens, not far from here in Roxbury. And Orchard Gardens is an amazing success story of a school where the principal fired his security guards and hired more arts teachers. And and I can imagine there were those who shook their heads and went, this is, not going to work. But it's a place where you open the door and you're in an oasis of light. What Darren said this morning, we need light. It's a place of light, as you can see when you open that door. There's Little Buck. So you saw him earlier celebrating where he came from, celebrating his school, and this is him at a school in Detroit. There he is at Inner City Arts. The first time I met Little Buck was at Inner City Arts to teach those students, me and Yo-Yo and Little Buck, bringing the light. Lame Deer, Montana, seat of the Northern Cheyenne Nation. This definitely goes with some sort of caption of, please try this with me. Please. But they also, later on that same day, were working with instruments provided to them by the Turnaround Arts Program, preparing for a community event that brought their parents, brought community tribal leaders together, because that was all a part of this, that the idea that it doesn't happen in isolation from the community. This is a program that I wanted to share with you because it speaks to something that you just can't predict. As part of Turnaround Arts, we were able to bring together 3 schools, the Lame Deer, Montana School, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Orchard Gardens, to New York to do a project on the High Line photography project, where each student was given a camera in 2 hours, in addition to a history lesson and some other more rigorous work, and sent out to take photos for 2 hours. Then they had to come back and curate that down to a presentation of 3 to 5 pictures and present. Actually very hard in a day of digital photography when you take 1,000 photos. So this was a photo done by Starissa from Lame Deer, and it was followed up with a poetry project with Cece Longknife, who wrote this poem about that photo. There's a dark side looking at the bright side, waiting to be won, wanting to be won, and she later on recited that at the White House for the First Lady. This was the kind of thing that we couldn't have even anticipated, how things build on each other. Once you start, there's always a next step, and that was just thrilling to get to do. That led to the National Student Poets Program, Forever First Lady hosting yet again with the young poets from around the country, and that led to other partnership activities with amazing people. Last summer in Aspen, Ava meeting with the young poets and talking with them about their possibilities. Heroes like Yo-Yo, working in schools, but also part of an overall ethic, which led him to the border just a few weeks ago. And to a school in Detroit, with young Sterling Elliott, who's now sophomore at Juilliard, and winner of the Sphinx competition for excellence in classical music just this past March. So all of this was a part of pushing forward, but it had this underpinning, I keep coming back to it, of it doesn't happen just on its own. It was,
right. Right, it was the integration and the knowledge that we could bring arts together and artists as citizen artists working with us on policy to address these significant challenges. So Damian mentioned we started in 8 schools. We were in Iowa, Montana, New Orleans, Massachusetts, and over time, because we wanted to better understand what we were doing and what was working and what didn't, and to test the proposition that we so deeply believed in. And over a 3 or 4 year period, we collected information based on what we were doing, and we found out at the end of that period, we looked at the results, and what we found was what we had hoped for, that students were reading better, they were engaged in math and performing in math better, that attendance was up, and also the disciplinary problems were down. And I'm not talking about small, slight changes. I'm talking about significant changes. And when you compared the schools where where Turnaround Arts was present, and those artists were there, to other schools that were getting additional resources, to other schools in the district that weren't getting those resources, you could see significant improvement. And that led us to believe that it was important to scale what we were doing. And that's what policy also allows us to do. So what started out as 8 schools, now we're serving 57,000 students. We are working in 79 different schools, and we are working in 17 different states and the District of Columbia. But we also recognize, because at the end of every administration, things change. We didn't know who was going to sit in the White House next. We really did not know who was going to be sitting in the White House next. But to prepare for that, there was also our resolve to find a permanent home for Turnaround Arts. And that's when the Kennedy Center accepted the call, and that is where Turnaround Arts sits now. And so it is permanent, it's got a home, it has resources, it has support that allows for the scaling that I just described, something that we know works, something that we know can be such a powerful force in the life of young people, and to fulfill and to meet those aspirations that they have for themselves, whether it is to be like so many of you in this room who have incredible artistic talent, or someone who wishes that she did but keeps trying, or whether they choose to be scientists or engineers or teachers or doctors or lawyers or whatever it is that they choose to be.
Yeah, I think that it never happens in a vacuum. It was with partners. I'm thinking about the Ford Foundation specifically, thinking about companies like Crayola, National Association of Music Merchants, all coming together in the belief that this was work that actually mattered, that it really was work. And the rigor factor, that this was hard and meant to be hard, and we do it because it was hard. I mean, it's the work that matters, that it wasn't decorative, was implicit from the very beginning. And I think that that's, undervalued, that idea in society in general. I think that's led to a lack of prioritization for the arts as an educational force. But this was a step to fight that, and it's so gratifying to see that it goes on.
Right. And this idea that, as you were saying, not just decorative, in a place, when you think about arts and their place in the White House, an evolution that's also taken place there.
Right. So this was John F. Kennedy's administration welcoming great cellist of the day, Pablo Casals, to play, which is an archetype of musical excellence, certainly, for some.
But it was also, as you can imagine, a pretty elite room.
Yes.
Everybody wasn't in that room.
That's right, for some, that's right. And then you have this, which was the culminating event which we did in the White House at the end of each year, bringing the students from around the country to compete in the White House talent show, where everybody wins. They performed, and they performed. And they celebrated with the First Lady, and this one's captioned, "Oh my God."
Because
somebody was arriving. And the value of that in Primature is just unbelievable. Whatever school I went to had a seal, President's Committee on Arts and Humanity, on their door, where they go in when they're late, be sitting right there, and they'd say, we have the backing of the President of the United States for what we're doing in this school. And it meant so much to the idea, but also, again, to the work. It came from this. That's what launched it. What didn't happen didn't skip this step. It was artists like Alfre Woodard, so many others now who've joined in this.
But not just there.
Not just there.
But there.
Right there, too. And in partnership always with the schools themselves, with the faculty, with providing professional development tools, providing resources, providing an annual summer conference to develop the skills and to share the knowledge, the best practices that were going into the work year after year after year. I just got my invitation to the next one that's coming.
Yeah. And the coaching that took place, and the idea, we know teachers already have so much that they have to do in a classroom, that this would be additive, that this would be supportive of the work that they were already doing in the classroom, and not seen as or felt as a burden.
That's right. It literally was all about how do we feed into this possibility for these kids so that they can really reach all the way. And that's our last slide. I think, I'd love to say that revisiting this, these images is particularly, poignant in some way for me because of the fact that it lives on. And we know this is going on right now in those schools, right as we're meeting here today, that this work is going on. But also in the intervening time, since 2016, I now am the president of Juilliard. And the idea that is a opportunity of width as well, of broadening of opportunity and voices. And I want to tell you a short story that Sarah came to visit last fall at Juilliard, and she did a little module the class I teach on arts and society, and talk to the students about vision and justice and the idea and how it related to their path. And it was a room of about 40 actors, dancers, and musicians. And watching their recognition of their own place in it was so important for me to see how these young artists who are so driven in so many ways, come to Juilliard, you have to be pretty driven. You're going on a path. But then to realize the sheer scope and the scale of what it was about, to be an artist in society. And later on, one of the students wrote a story about her grandmother, who went to Juilliard as a pianist in the 1940s, and dedicated it to Sarah, to say, you know, that this kind of representation is what we all need to see, the invisible visible, and inspired so many people around the school to see that work that you did, Sarah. And it's just such a thrill to get to be here, to partake in it and to build off of it. And the stories that matter need to be told. Her name is Julia Warren, Jules Warren, and her grandmother was also Julia Warren. And that is a part of Juilliard's history that we're going to be telling more and more. I discovered 2 weeks ago that Clarence Jones studied at Juilliard. If you know who Clarence Jones is lawyer for Dr. Martin Luther King, speechwriter, incredible human, and incredible clarinet player as well. This is a part of our history too, that we always have to show the range that everybody does count and everybody does get a chance to participate.
Right. And the reality, and he is the embodiment of this, but that artists play such an important role. They are not just wanted, but desperately needed if we are to achieve equity and social justice and the society, the globe, that we aspire to.
That's right. And to think of it as always a process, that its creativity is in fact the key to thinking. We heard earlier about it's asking a question. It is asking a better question. It's saying, what can we do together that we can't do alone? And how can we be creative in a true sense at everything we do? That these children deserve that opportunity, that light, as Darren said, to open that light.
So thank you.
Thank you
for the work that you do.
Thank you so much for your incredibly inspiring conversation. Hi all, my name is Inaara Shiraz. I am a senior here at the college, and it is my great privilege to be joining you all today as one of the many Vision and Justice student ambassadors. I want to take time to thank Melody Barnes and Damian Woetzel for engaging in such a candid and honest conversation about the Turnaround Arts program and the intersection of arts and politics. We have had the chance to witness the power that is tapped into when we create space for these conversations that are not often had elsewhere. At this moment, as we forge on, I would like the audience to enjoy a short break of about 15 minutes. We hope to see you all back very shortly. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I feel as if this is a convening that's resulting in a family gathering, a family that we didn't even know we had. There's an incredible energy in this room. I'm so honored to be able to invite to the stage extraordinary individuals who will be able to help us think through what functioned as the real catalyst in many ways for this convening. The Vision Justice Project has momentum in part because there are questions that we need to address to understand the nexus of art, race, and justice. And one of those questions is about how technology is playing a role in all of this. What are the consequences of seeing injustice disseminated virally as civic data through images today because of the speed of technology? What are the ways in which we can harness the digital realm to actually work for justice? How do we dislodge the embedded racial hierarchies that are built into our technology itself? The camera has inherent biases that we will hear about from our colleagues and friends today. Race, technology, and algorithmic bias is the topic of our next panel, and we'll hear more about the questions that we all need to address from our extraordinary visionary leader, Darren Walker, who's president of the Ford Foundation, fantastic colleague, Latanya Sweeney, professor of government and technology in residence here at Harvard, and Joy Buolamwini, who will begin the panel with a brief performance, and then will be joined by her colleagues. Thank you.
Joy Buolamwini. I am a poet of code, telling stories that make daughters of diasporas dream and sons of privilege pause. Today, it is my honor to share with you a piece called AI, Ain't I a Woman?, where I asked Sojourner Truth's 19th century question that she raised in 1851 at the first Women's Rights Convention to 21st century algorithms on the faces of some of the most iconic women in the world. And my mom is here with me today, so this performance is dedicated to her, the original artist. My heart smiles as I bask in their legacies, knowing their lives have altered many destinies. In her eyes, I see my mother's poise. In her face, I glimpse my auntie's grace. In this case of deja vu, a 19th century question comes into view in a time when Sojourner Truth asked, "Ain't I a woman?" Today, we pose this question to new powers, making bets on artificial intelligence, hope towers. The Amazonians peek through windows blocking deep blues as faces increment scars. Old burns, new urns, collecting data chronicling our past, often forgetting to deal with gender, race, and class. Again, I ask, ain't I a woman? Face by face, the answers seem uncertain. Young and old, proud icons are dismissed. Can machines ever see my queens as I view them? Can machines ever see our grandmothers as we knew them? Ida B. Wells, data science pioneer, hanging facts, stacking stats on the lynching of humanity, teaching truths hidden in data, each entry and omission, a person worthy of respect. Shirley Chisholm, unbought and unbossed, the first Black congresswoman, but not the first to be misunderstood by machines well-versed in data-driven mistakes. Michelle Obama, unabashed and unafraid to wear her crown of history, yet her crown seems a mystery to systems unsure of her hair. A wig, a bouffant, a toupee? Maybe not. Are there no words for our braids and our locks? The sunny skin and relaxed hair make Oprah the first lady. Even for her face, well known, some algorithms falter, echoing sentiments that strong women are men. We laugh, celebrating the successes of our sisters with serena smiles. No label is worthy of our beauty. Thank you.
That's really good. It was wonderful.
Give it up, Joy Buolamwini.
Joy, Latanya,
Darren.
what a joyous occasion this is to have this Black girl magic, this brilliance enveloped in this room. Dr. Latanya Sweeney wouldn't tell you this about herself because she's a woman of great modesty. The first African American woman to receive a PhD in computer science at MIT. Joy Buolamwini would not tell you that the PhD in computer science that she will shortly receive is an additional credential stacked on top of that Rhodes Scholarship. And the room full of credentials that reflect the ways in which excellence is personified in our community. Both of you are pioneers in a space where women like you are often invisible, are not present in the room, and yet you have demanded that the doors be open. And you are giving insight and shedding light on the pernicious effects of something most of us believe to be simply unbiased. I mean, how could AI, the promise of AI is that at last we can have objective measurements, evaluation, systems that move us from the injustice in the analog world to justice in the digital world. So can we have justice in this new digital world? Latanya, when you came to the Ford Foundation and blew the roof off of the building with the presentation you did demonstrating how the effects of racism manifest in simple exercises of aggregating names. Could you tell us a little bit about how we see that manifest on the internet?
Sure. Actually, that story started with when I had first arrived here at Harvard, and I was being interviewed by a reporter. And the reporter wanted to see an article I had written, so I go and I typed my name into Google. And up popped the link to the paper, but also some ads that implied I had an arrest record. And the reporter said, forget the article, tell me about the time you were arrested. And I said, well, I wasn't arrested. And he says, then why did your computer say you were? And so we go back and forth for a little bit, and I click on the link into paying the fee, all just to show that the company, one, had no arrest record for anyone named Latanya Sweeney. But that started me taking 2 months, typing in the names of real people, trying to understand how this came to be. And I did hundreds of thousands of searches across the United States and learned that the company had actually put down ads on the names of all real Americans, or real adults rather, who they believe lived in the United States. But if your name was given more often to a black baby than a white baby, an ad would pop up implying you had an arrest record. But if your name was given more often to white babies, it didn't. And the difference was huge. It was like 80 to 20% like difference. And discrimination in the United States isn't illegal, but we do have protected groups in certain situations, and one of those groups are blacks, and one of those situations is employment. And the argument that I made was that when you apply for a job, someone will look online to see what information is about you. And this put African American and black applicants at a tremendous disadvantage, because right away the computer was sort of implying something about them that often wasn't true. That it turned out to be exactly what was needed to open in the Department of Justice a civil rights investigation. And it was the first time any of us, I'm a computer scientist by training, and it was the first time any of us thought in terms of, oh my gosh, this computer is racist. And how did this come to be? And so that was sort of the start of a real awakening that now we see it engaged in so many ways. that the pursuit of technology is not exempt from the same ills that we find in other parts of our society, and maybe even be more potent today.
But before you, this had not happened. So why didn't some white guy, computer scientist, figure this out?
Well, first of all, if he was searching for his name, he would have gotten a nice neutral ad. So he may not have been sparked by it. So this speaks directly to the idea of me being who I am in that situation and having one of those black-sounding first names.
And so what can we extrapolate from this? Because I know that some of the work that you have continued to do has looked at the predictive analytics that are being used around which major decisions are being made that impact people's lives far beyond employment.
Yeah. So I was also I took time off from Harvard to be the Chief Technology Officer at the Federal Trade Commission. And one of the things that became very clear is how technology was allowing the very specific types of fraud, very specific ways to disenfranchise people to really exist. And that was everything from, if you're on the internet, so for most households in the United States, everyone's most frequently visited websites are the same first 10. But after number 10, they deviate greatly, specifically based on whether or not you have a child, your income, your education level, your race, and your interest. And the more you get into a community that you feel is more like you, the more you trust. And those are the places where huge frauds happen. And so that was kind of this interesting relationship we began to learn over and over again at the FTC around how people trust their social networks and so forth in the internet and how they can be manipulated against them. And we were able to, that became part of, when I came back to Harvard, our investigations with students. I teach a class here called Tech Science to Save the World. And we began looking through 2016, how would old ways in which people were disenfranchised from voting show up in technology? And the work showed many discoveries, but one of them was we were the first to show those 36 voter registration websites and their vulnerabilities. And this year we taught the class and we were able to point out a vulnerability in the 2020 census that will go online. These things matter because they're subtle in the sense that if somebody disenfranchises you to vote online, you still show up at the polling place, except you're not in the poll book. So they give you a provisional ballot. So you think you voted, but in many states, the vote doesn't count. Or in the census, a miscount determines the amount of representatives we have in the House of Representatives, and therefore can tilt the balance of Republicans and Democrats. So these things are, in some ways, tend to be small, but the manifestations of them are huge.
So Joy, you have started an organization called the Algorithmic Justice League, a new civil rights organization for the 21st century. And you have also brought Amazon, IBM to their knees. I mean, it is you who shame them on the front pages of the New York Times and in media by calling them out on the ways in which they were making millions of dollars selling facial recognition programs and other products that were actually flawed. And your research demonstrated that they were flawed. But they didn't want to hear that from you, it sounds like.
Well, with the Algorithmic Justice League, I started it because I was working on an art project that went awry. And so I'm sure everybody in this audience has heard of the white gaze, the male gaze. Well, to that, I add the coded gaze. And the coded gaze is a reflection of the priorities, preferences, and also prejudices of those who have the power to shape technology. So I was working on an art project that used face detection, so when I looked at a mirror, it would say, "Hello, beautiful," or it would put a lion on my face, or I could become Serena Williams, just for fun. I'm at the Media Lab, we do these kinds of explorations. So as I was working on this project in a class called Science Fabrication, which is about visioning what might be and trying to see if you can manifest it now, I noticed there was a problem. The face detection software I was using, it worked fine for my friend's face. But when it came to my face, I ran into a little problem. But I got an assist, right? So literally coding in a white mass, I mean, Fanon already said it, but I didn't think it would be so literal when it happened. And so I had the opportunity to share this on the TED platform, and in that talk, this is when I talked about launching the Algorithmic Justice League, because I'm thinking, well, if they can't get our faces right, what else could be going wrong? And I also noticed I had something in common with the women of Wakanda. And so when the Black Panther came out, I decided to run their faces. They were either not detected, some of them were misgendered. But then I decided to test out age classification, age estimation. So those red columns you're seeing are under the age header. It's verified Black don't crack. We see it here. But it really became more serious in terms of thinking towards justice when I read a report from Georgetown Law showing 1 in 2 adults, over 130 million people, has their face in a face recognition network that can be searched by law enforcement unwarranted using technology that hasn't been audited for accuracy. This is why one of the reasons why we audited Amazon, because they're selling to law enforcement right now. They're trialing this technology with the FBI. Now, some people are also saying, look, not being detected, that's not the worst thing, right? Maybe we got a windfall. But for me, it wasn't not being detected, but what happens when you're misidentified. So in the UK, where they've actually done performance metrics, they showed that they had false positive match rates of over 90%, more than 2,400 innocent people being falsely matched, and even cases of women being matched with men. Last week, a teenager, an African-American teenager, is suing Apple for $1 billion because he's been misidentified through some of the facial analysis recognition technology that's out there. So because this technology is actually in the real world and can change people's lives in a material way, that's why I started the Algorithmic Justice League, and that's why I've been challenging large tech companies.
And recent research, which we were emailing about a couple of weeks ago, truly bowled me over. So talk about the results of the research around autonomous vehicles and people of color.
So you probably know where this goes. Let me back up really quickly. So my MIT research was called Gender Shades, and what I did along with Dr. Timnit Gebru, and you see us posing for Bloomberg 50 right there, looking fierce with our co-founder of Black in AI, what we were showing was that if you looked at skin type as a way of evaluating facial analysis technology, you would find different kinds of disparities than if you just looked at race. So other researchers took that idea and said, okay, let's apply it to self-driving cars and let's look at pedestrian tracking technology. So using the similar kind of methodology that was developed in Gender Shades, they tested it on the cars. Turns out they're less accurate for darker-skinned individuals when it comes to tracking. So the promises of self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles, literally not being seen has real-world consequences.
So so let's just be really clear. So in this new digital world, if you are Black, you are more likely to be run over by an autonomous vehicle?
We gotta be careful. Extra careful. So that's why I go in whiteface sometimes, just so we can be
But that's the irony, is that in this new digital world, we may literally have to wear whiteface.
Yeah. That is the new irony, sadly.
Well, I would like to say I do think computer science can do better.
Says the PhD from MIT. So tell us how we make that happen, Dr. Sweeney.
So look, technology design is really the new policymaker. And these decisions it's really a reflection of people building technology in their own image. AI has always been this idea of building machines in your likeness. And as they're building AI, what is like them is being overfitted to the fact that they're often white men in their 20s.
And this is something that I call the problem of pale male data sets. So
Pale male data set.
Pale male and sometimes stale, but often male data sets. Okay, so when I was doing the research for gender shades, I started looking at all of these data sets of faces. And I looked at data sets that were used as gold standards. And what came up time and time again was the overrepresentation of lighter-skinned individuals, the overrepresentation of men, and the underrepresentation of women, and especially women of color. So if you're thinking about AI and machine learning as one of the ascendant approaches, machines are learning from what? Data. So in this case, data is destiny, and if we have pale male data sets, we're destined to fail the rest of society, whether it's on our streets because we can't detect different kinds of individuals, whether it's in a healthcare setting where people are trying to detect things like melanoma or see if you can infer things like early signs of dementia. So the lack of representation, I call this power shadows that end up in our data sets and our evaluation benchmarks as well.
So, Latanya, you were the CTO at the FTC. What does government need to do about this? Is there a role for government in this? I mean, in the old analog world, we had a Civil Rights Act. We had the EEOC. Yeah. We had a regulatory regime that protected the public interest. Yeah. We have yet to define what the public interest is in this new digital world.
Well, a lot of the work that we do, I take the fact that people fought very hard and we saw a lot of that in the scenes that were shown earlier, for the rights and the regulations that we have now. As technology rolls out, it just it dictates how we're going to live our lives by what technology allows us to do or doesn't allow us to do. And what people don't seem to realize is that every democratic value is up for grabs by what technology allows or doesn't allow. And so it's been incredibly important to be able to produce technologists sort of in the public interest, a group of technologists who are interested in understanding how to find these unforeseen consequences, to shore up journalism, to shore up our regulators, and to help us really apply the laws and regulations we have to technology. And also to help technologists do their job better. For many people in high tech, I don't think this was ever intended. For many of them, it really is an unintended consequence. So there's also a call or a need for technologists to do their job better in the high tech companies as well.
But we know that, for example, one of the reasons I've come to know you is because at the Ford Foundation, we have been working on this new field of public interest technology. Yeah. Because just as there needed to be a field created of public interest law in the 1960s, we need to think about what the public interest is in this new digital world. And in fact, it's the private sector who has determined the bounds of what is public and private. And we saw in the Zuckerberg hearings where we witnessed the interaction of capitalism and democracy lost. Yeah. Because there was no one sitting behind those Congress people, passing them notes, giving them questions to interrogate the tech executives, because most of the capacity in this space is in the private sector. Yeah. And so one of the things we have to think about is how do we train a generation of public interest technologists like yourselves who are going to fight the fight for justice in this new digital world. So, Joy, from your standpoint, what's needed most at this time to protect the public interest?
It's a big question, and it's not just one thing. I still believe that as we're talking about public interest technologists and as we're thinking about how computer scientists, how policymakers can shape the future, we have to also remind ourselves the importance of the artist and the storytellers. So the work that I've done thus far, I really believe that part of the reason it's gained attention is because of that visual of coding in a white mask. There were FBI experts who did facial analysis tests before, but they didn't take the approach of calling out. I also think that how we're trained as computer scientists has to change so that there's a sense of responsibility. We had a doctor up here earlier who was very courageous in standing up for Flint, saying, "We take an oath." We don't do that as computer scientists. We think we can create the world, we can break things, and until it's actually confronted, we don't actually have to make any changes. And so I think changing how we learn to be computer scientists will be a huge part of it, but not thinking that computer scientists or technologists can solve it alone.
So you see the role of the arts and humanities? I mean, so do you see a new curricular being needed, President Bacow, here and at other places?
Absolutely, and I'd like to talk about how, let's say, looking at the social sciences influenced my own work. So with gender shades, we went through, we made a new data set, et cetera, and so forth. And what we were able to show is that the current way we're taught, thinking about the curriculum, is to look at data and information in aggregate. And so if you see the aggregate performance for some of these companies, it seemed okay. So then we said, let's break it down and let's look at what the implications are for gender, and we see gaps. Let's look at what the implications are for skin type, and we see gaps. But what I was able to do was then bring in Kimberly Crenshaw and say there's something we can learn as computer scientists from what she did with anti-discrimination law, saying that single axis analysis is not enough. And so what happens when you marry that with computer vision? Well, this is what we got. We provided a new kind of perspective of looking at the data. And here we see that for one group, the pale males, you have 100% performance. And then for another group, women of color, right, you have the worst performance. And when we disaggregate that, we got to error rates as high as 47%. So as a computer scientist sitting in my body, as somebody who's also reading Crenshaw, I'm able to then provide new insights into what we're doing with computer vision and computer science.
Dr. Sweeney, are you encouraged by what you are seeing in the classroom here at Harvard?
Oh my gosh. So the Save the World class, you know, students want to do good, and they want the work that they do to really matter and change the world. And the class has really touched the lives of a lot of the students. They've gone out, they've done amazing things. They've gotten Facebook to fix bugs. They've gotten Airbnb to address price discrimination. They were the first to point out problems in the Affordable Care Act. I mean, the list of accomplishments that these students have done goes on and on and on. And we do have to thank the Ford Foundation too, because the Ford Foundation has given us the funds to allow the students to explore these unforeseen consequences wherever they may be. And the students have just really, they literally mean save the world. And it's been phenomenal. It's made a big difference. I just want to say also that the space of problems are huge. So from algorithms being used not just in our homes, but also determining what you're going to see on your social media feed, to also determining sentencing and recommendations for around recidivism, all of which show unfairness and bias in them. And so the amount of work is huge. So some of it is a matter of shoring up and giving knowledge to those who have the power to help us make the change.
And Joy, final word. What do you have to say to this audience of people who are assembled here because we care about justice in America and in the world. And we don't all understand this new technology. In fact, it's a little frightening to some of us. Should we be frightened?
We should be working together so there's less to fear. And I hope that all of you will join me in moving towards algorithmic justice, because we've entered the age of automation overconfident and underprepared. You see in this chart behind me all of the areas in which automated decision making is starting to enter our lives. So it's up to us, we who are here and also in the live stream, to be asking questions. If you're going for a job interview and they're using AI to make a determination, ask what's going on. Also share your stories. We have bias in the wild reports that are submitted to the Algorithmic Justice League, where people are like, my Snapchat not work, whatever it might be. So I think it's really important that people feel they have a voice, and you don't feel like, oh, if I'm not a technologist, if I don't have PhDs from MIT, I can't be part of this conversation. But that's not true. We need to move towards participatory AI, where those who are at the margins are actually centered when it comes to decision making around the technology that's shaping our lives and shaping society.
Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Latanya, Sweeney, and Joy Buolamwini!
And Darren.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tommie Shelby, and I'm the chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and a professor of philosophy here in Harvard. But before I introduce the next panel, I just wanted to say that was an incredibly powerful and informative panel. So thanks so much for that, and thanks for the wonderful performance from Joy Buolamwini, which was a great way to start off a quite deep and in some ways scary, but as we say, hopeful conversation. So it's my pleasure, as I say, and an honor to introduce the participants of the next panel. And the thematic focus of the panel is mass incarceration and cultural narratives. So over-incarceration, over-criminalization, horrid and inhumane prison conditions, harsh and merciless sentences, the torture and trauma of solitary confinement, and the civic death that's imposed even after release from prison. These practices are destroying the lives of many individuals and many communities. Mass incarceration is, of course, marked by systemic racial injustice, from policing and prosecution to prison administration and reentry. The problem has rightly and urgently become the object of organized resistance, both inside and outside prison walls. Prisons are too often out of public view, where we can easily ignore their presence and forget about those who are confined. So in this domain especially, we need artists and storytellers, many of whom are or were incarcerated themselves, to bring the prison system out of the shadows and to shine a light on the many injustices, the burdened, the forgotten, and the unseen. Such work is also essential, of course, for holding law enforcement and legislators accountable for how they administer crime control practices and how they treat those in their custodial care. And so to help us think through these complex issues and of the role of art and cultural counter-narratives in addressing them, we have a truly distinguished group of individuals. Moderating the panel will be Danielle Allen. Allen is the James Bryant Conant University professor here at Harvard University and also the director of Harvard's Edmund J. Saffer Center for Ethics. She's a wide-ranging political theorist who has published in democratic theory and political sociology and in the history of political thought, both ancient and modern. She's the author of many influential books, including Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in Defense of Equality, published in 2014, Education and Equality, and most recently, and perhaps most pertinent for this panel's theme, is the amazing book, Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A. Allen is a MacArthur Fellow and an elected member of the American Philosophical Society and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Elizabeth Hinton is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences in the Departments of History and African American Studies here at Harvard. Hinton's research focuses on the persistence of poverty and of racial inequality in 20th century United States. She is the author of the award-winning and really field-defining book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. She's quite a passionate defender of the rights of prisoners and of the formerly incarcerated to get an education, get access to education. Hinton's numerous op-eds can be found in such venues as the Boston Review, the Los Angeles Times, The Nation, the New York Times, and Time Magazine. She is a Ford Foundation Fellow and an Andrew Carnegie Fellow as well. And Bryan Stevenson, who of course will be addressing us tonight in his keynote lecture, and we'll get a proper introduction from the incomparable Elizabeth Alexander. But here I'll be brief. Stevenson is the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, in Montgomery, Alabama. And under his leadership, EJI has won major legal challenges, eliminating unfair sentences, exonerating the innocent from innocent death row prisoners, confronting abuse of the incarcerated and the mentally ill, and aiding children prosecuted as adults. In fact, he recently won a historic ruling, as many of you know, in the U.S. Supreme Court, banning mandatory life without parole sentences for children 17 or younger. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and has been awarded some 34 honorary degrees, maybe more since I've written that. And he is the author of the award-winning and deeply moving New York Times bestseller, Just Mercy. In April 2018, EJI opened the new museum, the Legacy Museum, From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration, built on the site of a former slave warehouse in downtown Montgomery. This is a companion to the National Memorial to Victims of Lynching, the extraordinary National Memorial for Peace and Justice. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Danielle Allen, Elizabeth Hinton, and Bryan Stevenson.
It is such an honor to be with everybody here today. My sister friend Elizabeth, Bryan, there's a small list of people of whom I say, I just feel grateful to have been alive when this man walked the earth. But it's also the case that, as Hank Willis Thomas said earlier, that one of the beautiful things about this conversation today is the discovery that we've all been working together. Some of us knew that about some of the rest of us, but now we all know it about each other, and that is an incredibly powerful thing. So we're going to do more of that working together in this conversation. We're switching from that remarkable, unsettling tale of control to another story of control. Narrative is at the core of all of this, and few people are more eloquent on that subject than the two people I'm sitting here with. I'm going to start with one small digression into deep history, though, for our country anyway, because it came up earlier this morning and because I think we're going to get to history in this conversation. The Declaration of Independence came up, and Sarah started with that terrific re-rendering of the famous image of the signing. So I wanted to add one additional image to your archive of re-renderings because there's a little story that goes with it about just how deep the narrative problems go and in what small, minute ways they show up. So I wrote this book that Professor Shelby alluded to, our Declaration of Independence, and it says "our" for a reason, because I'm putting myself there in the story, and the book was born in a night class that I taught on the south side of Chicago for low-income adults, where we read the Declaration of Independence together. And of all the texts we read, it was the most powerful for all of us, because we sat there listening to the grievances about the king and thinking about the city of Chicago. And it's not hard to have a list of grievances about the city of Chicago. and to have a recognition of the relationship between language of rights and freedom, diagnosing your circumstances, and looking forward to a course of action to achieve change. My students were all there because they were seeking change in their lives, and they got that text, and I wrote that book for them. And that is everywhere through every single page of that book. But when I got my cover design, all right, it was that engraving of all the 56 white signers of the Declaration. I was like, I said, our Declaration, not their Declaration. So we've had all these incredible artists on the stage today and designers and these beautiful visionaries. I am not such a person. So the best I could do was say, you gotta add a photo of my students on top of that other photo. First I just said, add a photo of my students, and it came back below the signers. So I said, no. That's not, this is our Declaration. And my students there in that picture, reading, writing, talking, deliberating, deciding about the future of their community and their city, were doing exactly the same thing as the people in the picture below. But I had to make this case. 2014, the sort of designer read my book, and still I had to push the old pictures out of their mind, like literally push the old pictures out of their mind. That's what we're talking about here today. And so I want to start with very simple questions for both my colleagues, and then we'll get into the deeper, harder work of why it is we need narrative work to end the problem of mass incarceration. So my simple story is come back to that one in a second. We all know Bryan's remarkable monument. And you can say so many important things about it, but right now I only want you to tell us, and here's one more picture up here for you to think about, what visually this means to you, what you feel when you look at your monument.
Well, in a lot of ways, I went to Berlin, and I went to the Brandenburg Square where they have the Holocaust Memorial, and what struck me about it is that there are no words. They actually trust people to enter that place with a narrative about the Holocaust that will allow them to have an emotional and meaningful experience with these very abstract figures. When we built our memorial, we knew we couldn't do that, because in this country, we don't actually have a narrative that talks about this era of racial terrorism and lynching. We knew we had to contextualize it, we had to create a path. And so the first thing you see is a sculpture of enslaved people in chains, standing with dignity, but standing in suffering. And the most remarkable thing for me is how many people have said, I've been in this country my whole life, I've never seen a sculpture on slavery that tries to depict the brutality of enslavement and the humanity of those enslaved. And then we narrate this journey, and then we get into the memorial. And what we want people to see are these brown structures, first at eye level, very human. You can read the names. And then when you get to the second quarter, the floor drops and they begin to rise. And then you get to the third quarter and they're above you. And that's the thing about lynching and racial terror. The people who perpetrated that violence could have buried the bodies and probably killed even more people that we would never know about. But they actually wanted to do the opposite. They wanted to lift them up. They wanted to torment and taunt and terrorize communities of color. But that's why we don't talk about thousands of victims of lynchings. We talk about millions of victims of lynchings, because every person of color was terrorized and menaced by that violence. And so we want to replicate those dynamics, because we don't think people should have a safe place to stand when they're confronting something like racial terrorism, lynching in this country that went unaddressed for 100 years. And then the last thing we show people is the park, where we have the replicas of the monuments, and we have a sculpture of 3 women. The monument, the memorial, is actually in the neighborhood where black women organized in the 1950s to make the Montgomery bus boycott this catalyst that pushed this nation into civil rights. And we have that statue. And then we have Hank Willis Thomas's powerful statue at the end. But in the park, we have a replica of each of them, because we're calling every one of these counties to action. We want every county in America where lynching took place to claim the replica of these monuments, take it back to their county, and begin this process of truth and reconciliation locally.
I'm going to come back to that point about action in a minute, but I first want to talk to Elizabeth about her book cover. and ask you to share the story of this and how it connects to your own understanding of your role as a historian, again, trying to push those old stories, old pictures out of people's minds.
I became a historian in order to change narratives. I grew up in the 1980s and really came of age in the 1990s at the height of the impact of crack in low-income and particularly African-American communities, and the rhetoric about gun violence that was going on in the 80s and 90s. And I saw directly the ways in which drug addiction and violence played out among members of my own family, and knew that the narratives going on at this time, the idea that somehow, the super predator narratives, the idea that, that black people were innately criminal and violent, weren't true. And so I've always been passionate about these issues and seeking to change these issues through historical understanding and research, which is partly how I came to the research at the center of this book. The cover depicts a moment from the Newark Uprising in 1967. So this was one of the largest incidents of collective urban violence and unrest that the United States witnessed in the 1960s, coming a week before the uprising in Detroit, Michigan, which required the deployment of federal troops. And in Newark, contrary to many of the narratives that are told about these incidents of collective violence and community violence, most of the people, of the hundreds of people who lost their lives during these incidents in the 1960s, the vast majority were, of course, black residents at the hands of police. During the Newark uprising, there was a lot of police sniping, a lot of shooting going on in the air. And the cover actually depicts what we would regard today as a drive-by shooting. This is an early drive-by shooting by police officers. Drive-bys are characterized by the use of relatively massive manpower in a vehicle moving and just kind of shooting at a stationary target or a crowd of people. And this gets us to kind of rethink our narratives about violence. Who is a victim? Who has a monopoly on violence? When is violence justified? When we look at this cover, we don't necessarily see it as a drive-by shooting, but in fact, that's what it is. In 1967, in the 1980s and 90s, when drive-by shootings became far too common in low-income neighborhoods of color, these things are discussed as if they're kind of the natural outgrowth of pathology in these communities, instead of a historically distinct manifestation of a convergence of decisions, policy decisions, disinvestments, and historical inequalities playing out in this moment in the late 20th century.
So the power on this stage is phenomenal, the power invested in changing narratives. And the other thing that's beautiful about the chance to have this conversation is to name the nature of the work, which is this effort to connect changing narratives to concrete changes in policy, in people's actions, in embodied experiences. Bryan has said one of the most profound things I know of on this subject of where narrative and action come together. He says of his work with death row clients, "I became aware that the rights framework, the insistence on the rule of law, was still going to be constrained by the meta-narratives that push judges to stop at a certain point, the environment outside the courts. That's what pushed me to think more critically about narrative, not just within a brief, within a case, within an action, but more broadly." Right? Rights only go so far. They are limited by narrative. Okay, it's that coming together is the key thing. So to really, drive home the point about what we're trying to push over, I wanted to share an image of a correctional center from downtown Chicago. So this one is not out of sight. To the contrary. This one is solidified with beauty. You may not think it's beautiful, but it's intended to be beautiful as a piece of architecture. I'm guessing, now the David Adagio will probably come up here and tell me how wrong I am to say that. But it's designed by a very famous architect, Harry Weiss. It's an example of Chicago modernism and one of its later iterations, as I understand. Again, Sarah will educate me afterwards, I'm sure. And it is this incredibly minimalist form, a triangle with these tiny slit windows. It's a sculptural object, helping everybody feel proud about incarceration. And as David did say in Theaster, when we build the environment, it fixes those narratives. So the narrative work that you're trying to do to end mass incarceration is about making this building so ugly, we want to tear it down. Okay, how are we going to do that? Bryan, what's next?
Well,
what do we need to do?
We have to reveal the pain and the suffering and the inhumanity that's going on within the building. And if we don't see the people inside, if we don't know that people are being locked down, if we don't know that there might be 10 and 11-year-old children in there, because Illinois doesn't have a minimum age for trying a child as an adult, who are being tormented, if we don't know about the suffering, then we're not going to actually see what's wrong with the building. And for me, that's the great challenge that we face, is to tear down the facade so that you can actually see the inequality and injustice that's happening inside. And that was the point that I was trying to make earlier with that quote you read. The law won't help us. It won't help us. We're going to need art and narrative and exploration and powerful books like Professor Hinton's to kind of pull away some of these things. You know, when this became clear to me, I'll just quick little mini thing, death penalty. 1972, the Supreme Court strikes down the death penalty because they conclude it's being applied arbitrarily. To the Legal Defense Fund, the death penalty was a civil rights issue. They knew that 87% of the people executed for the crime of rape in this country were black men accused of raping white women. 100% of the people executed for that offense were executed offenses involving victims who were white, even though women of color were 3 times more likely to be the victims of sexual assault. Court says it's arbitrary, unpredictable. Most people thought that was the end of the death penalty. The South revolts, says, no, we need the death penalty. And because the court didn't say it was cruel and unusual punishment, they come back with these new statutes. The court in 1976 upholds it, saying we can't conclude that these new statutes won't work any better than the old ones. Then comes McCleskey. And this is why when I talk to audiences, I feel like you can't understand what we're dealing with in the justice sector until you understand this case, where lawyers went to prove that the modern death penalty operated in a racially discriminatory manner. They looked at every homicide in Georgia over an 8-year time period. They came up with powerful data. 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black. 22 times more likely to get the death penalty if the defendant is black and the victim is white. They took the data to the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court accepted their evidence and nonetheless concluded that Georgia's death penalty was constitutional. And it's the rationale that really ought to break your heart. The first thing they said was, if we deal with racial disparities in the death penalty, it's going to be just a matter of time before we start seeing these disparities and arguments about these disparities for drug crimes and property crimes and misdemeanor crimes. And Justice Brennan wrote in his dissent that it was a, quote, fear of too much justice that allowed the court to rule the way they ruled. But it was the second thing that I have to tell you was the thing that radicalized my relationship as a young lawyer. The court said a certain quantum of discrimination, a certain amount of bias, a certain level of racial discrimination is, in our opinion, inevitable. That's the word they use to characterize this result. And having argued cases before the Supreme Court, I've stand there and I have to read equal justice under law. There is no way you can reconcile a doctrine of inevitability with this commitment to equal justice under law. And as I began to kind of see that manifest itself, what scared me, what shocked me, was this realization I had about 10 years ago. I'm a product of Brown. I grew up in a community where black kids had to go to to colored schools. We didn't have high schools for black kids in my community. Lawyers came into our community, made them open up to public schools. That's what attracted me about law, is they had the power to get people to do things that the democratic process wouldn't. But about 10 years ago, I realized that we couldn't win Brown versus Board of Education today. I don't think we could. We would not win Brown today. We don't have a court that's committed to equal justice sufficiently to help a disfavored and disenfranchised group have their rights respected against the political will of all of these masses. This court would not do it. And the reason why they won't do it is because we've lost that narrative struggle. And so for me, it's unmasking what's inside the building. It's actually exposing, telling the stories of inequality and injustice in a way where we cannot reconcile our commitment to equality and justice with these disparities, with this heartbreak, with this pain. I tell people that reading McCleskey was probably the hardest thing, one of the hardest things I've ever done. And I say that, with some history. When you represent people on death row, you have difficult challenges. And I represented a man some years ago who didn't have a lawyer. We tried to stop his execution. We weren't able to. And it was the first time I went down to be with somebody who was about to be executed. And I never will forget the conversation we had. This is when they still electrocuted people. And I was back there, and when I got there, they shaved the hair off of his body to make him more efficient when the electricity would pass through him. And he was really unnerved by that. But then he started telling me about his day. And what he said is that, Bryan, all day long people have been saying, what can I do to help you? They came to me this morning and said, what do you want for breakfast? What do you want for lunch? What do you want for dinner? He said, every 15 minutes somebody was saying, what can I do to help you? Can I get you the phone? Can I get you the stamps? Can I get you the letter? And I never will forget him saying, he said, Bryan, it's been such a strange day. He said, more people have asked me, what can I do to help you in the last 14 hours of my life than they ever did in the first 19 years of my life. And holding that man's hand, I couldn't help but think, yeah, where were they when you were 3 and you were being physically abused? Where were they when you were 7 and your mom died? Where were they when you were 11 and you were experimenting with drugs? Where were they when you came back from Vietnam traumatized? And with those questions resonating in my mind, they pulled that man away, strapped him to an electric chair, and executed him. But as hard as that was, it wasn't as hard as reading a decision from the United States Supreme Court talking about the inevitability of racial bias in the administration of the death penalty. And our society allowed it to happen. And that's why the artists and the narratives and the historians have had to get busy. And that's what excites me about being on the stage with the two of you, because that's what you're trying to expose.
I'd ask Bryan a follow-up. I'm so glad that you brought our attention to the McCleskey case, because as I read it, and I teach it in my Mass Incarceration and Historical Perspective course, and I discuss it in my book, I mean, this was the moment when it became impossible to prove racism in the criminal justice system, and it also coincides with the year, of course, when the 100-to-1 crack sentencing in 1986, when the disparity is introduced an Anti-Drug Abuse Act in Congress and passed by the federal government. So what I'm hearing you say is that that decision made you more cynical about the ability of the law to change narratives. Is this, did it cause you to kind of shift gears in your strategy?
I'd say it made me understand the limits of the law in ways that I hadn't been. I was a very young lawyer, and I was so struck with the power of the lawyers under Brown to do these things. And it's still true that we need the law. Like ending life without parole for children is not something we could do at the political process. Marriage equality isn't something we could do at the political process. So we still need it. But I realized that we're going to need our artists and our historians and our storytellers and our researchers to begin working on this narrative struggle to change the consciousness of those decision makers, of those justices, so that they would be too ashamed to talk about the inevitability of discrimination. And unfortunately, there's an absence of shame at the United States Supreme Court.
So, I want to pick up on that theme of shame, where it exists and where it doesn't exist. It's like it exists in all the wrong places, right? It doesn't exist where it should exist, and exists in all the wrong places. So I'm thinking about this building again, and you drew us straight to the specifics of Illinois. An 11-year-old could be in there facing the worst of penalties. And I don't have a single story I could pin on this building. I'm thinking of Hank's billboards again. I can't tell anybody's story that might be attached to this building. When I wrote Cuz, which is a story of my baby cousin, whom we lost to the criminal justice system, a 12-year sentence on his first arrest for an attempted carjacking, and released from prison after 11 years, killed 3 years later by somebody he'd met in prison. So at any rate, when I wrote that book, I went around the country talking about it. It was hard to talk about. And I had a friend who said to me, well, Danielle, just remember you're a story catcher. Because you're there, yes, you're telling your story, but what you're going to discover is that when you go there, everybody else is going to give you their story. And that's exactly what I found. And I thought of myself as like a butterfly net. Go around the world as a butterfly net, letting stories come to me. But the incredible thing about that, the real powerful lesson of it, was how many stories there are and how few we hear. And this is a completely obvious point if you think about it for 2 seconds, because 2.25 million people are incarcerated, and they all have people they're connected to, and that's every year for the last decade plus, et cetera. So you just add up the numbers and you realize that there are millions and millions of stories that I now think of as butterflies floating out there in the world that we don't hear. So I wanted to ask this question of, we need to hear the stories. Why don't we hear the stories? Is it shame? Are there other forces working? Elizabeth, you work really, really hard to get the stories of incarcerated people onto public stages like this. You did that a year ago. You had incredible voices here on this stage. Can you tell us what you think about why we don't hear all the stories we should hear and what we can do about it?
Well, I think in general, and this has to do with the core of the issues that we've been talking about for the past few days. You know, who gets to be seen as a human being? Who counts? Who's a citizen? Whose lives matter? And throughout our history, that has not been poor people, and that has not been people of color. And the stigma that is attached to criminality and certainly incarceration, the invisibility. I mean, I think, you know, the point that you made here is really important. This is in the middle of Chicago. But most of our prisons are in places far, far away from here, removed from society, barred from the people inside, barred from everyday human interaction. That's so crucial. And I think that the divisions in our society in general, and a lot of that has to do with narrative, a lot of that has to do with representation, but create an atmosphere of fear where we're unable to see our fellow human beings as human beings. Of course, this is wrapped up in our long history. Of course, this is wrapped up in this idea of inevitability, of criminality among people of color as being inevitable. That's something that I found and uncovered in my research and justified a lot the escalation of police and incarceration at all levels of government. But I think a lot of it just, you know, it has to do so much with whose voices get to be included and the divisions among us. I remain inspired by the abolitionist movement and the ways in which it really took getting the voices of enslaved Africans out there to generate awareness about the issue. And I think that's something that, you know, since I've been doing this work has really changed. And many of the formerly incarcerated people who are really at the forefront of criminal justice reform movements, you know, they would say those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so much of it is about, as we rethink, you know, approaches to problems of inequality and punishment, is how to amplify those voices and to help get those voices front and center in our discussions.
And so as you do work on getting the voices of incarcerated people out and collaborating with efforts that they're leading and building, can you tell us about one of the things that makes you most hopeful? Where do you see the most positive work happening right now?
I think that it's been amazing to me, even since I've been at Harvard, the ways in which thinking on this issue has changed, the ways in which these voices are becoming kind of part of our discussions about these issues. You know, since I've been here in the past 2 years, I've had the privilege and the honor to sit here at Sanders Theater, but in other venues around campus with formerly incarcerated people. I think that, you know, as people are become aware of the issue, become aware of the kind of arbitrary laws, and Tommie mentioned this in his introduction, and the kind of extremely harsh sentencing that has been attached to misdemeanor crimes, the problems of drug abuse, that our thinking on this has really begun to change. Of course, you know, the kind of important forces of popular narrative shifting has contributed to this kind of change in collective consciousness greatly from Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow book to Ava DuVernay's documentary, The 13th. I think that the more that we can begin to, present these issues in a completely different way to a popular audience, as Bryan just said, we will begin to plant the seeds that will help shift worldviews on these issues to realize that things like drive-by shootings in certain communities aren't natural, that gun violence is unacceptable, that the kind of systematic removal of entire groups of people from communities into faraway cages shouldn't happen in the land of the free.
So this is a good point of connection, right? I mean, one of the things we're getting is that there's all this taken for granted stuff. And here's another form of invisibility being brought into visibility, right? The taken for granted being brought into visibility so we can stop taking it for granted and put a new picture in that place.
Yeah, and I just think, to echo what Elizabeth is saying, because I think it's really important how there is this relationship between power and vulnerability and who can shape narrative and who can't. Because the truth is that, our history, when you're enslaved, you have to focus on freedom. And what happened to African Americans, we had to be entirely focused on being free. And then when we got free, we weren't safe. So then we had to focus on security. And then we got more secure, we didn't have any rights, and so we had to focus on rights. And what we keep forgetting in this country is that we're in the early days of a post-enslavement, post-terror, post-apartheid history. Right. We're just getting out of this horrific era. And for a long time, I think our foreparents thought that narrative struggle was a luxury. Right. And because of that, we didn't engage in it. And so the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. They were never required to repudiate racial inequality and white supremacy. And then, we got the federal government to intervene to stop mob lynching, but the lynchers won the narrative war. They didn't have to ever apologize.
I agree with you completely that the South won the narrative war, but the one place I'm going to push back is on the account you gave of our forefathers.
No, I'm not. It's not as if, listen, I wasn't doing narrative work for the first 20 years of my career. So I'm not suggesting, and our foreparents did. Look, as Frederick Douglass was out there, he was doing all about narrative. I'm just saying that collectively.
And our friend Du Bois, too.
Yeah.
Because I want to say his phrase. That was my real reason for pushing back on you, is because I wanted to say that Du Bois pushed us all to be co-creators in the kingdom of culture.
There have always.
I just wanted to say that out loud, okay?
No, there have always
been. Take that away. Co-creators in the kingdom of culture.
There have always been those people. I guess what I'm trying to say is that now we're living at a time where we can take over Sanders Theater. This didn't happen in the 1980s when I was a law student. And we can have a program that somebody like Sarah Lewis is organizing, and all of this. We have access and opportunity, and the question that I'm just going to keep insisting is that we engage and we use it. When I wrote my book, Just Mercy, I had the great fortune of working with Chris Jackson, an amazing black editor who, and I have this voice in my head as this uncle I grew up with, and he was always saying, they're not going to let you do that. And y'all know those kind of voices. And I said, I'm going to college. They're not going to let you go to college. And I said, I'm going to Harvard. They ain't not going to let you go to Harvard. And I've been hearing it my whole life. I said, we're going to open a museum on slavery. They're not going to let you do that. And I was writing Just Mercy, and I could hear him saying, they're not going to let you say that in that book. But Chris was the kind of editor who said, not only are going to let you do it, we want you to do it. And now we have these black artists, and we have these black activists, and we have historians and teachers. And the challenge is, are we going to use our narrative power and focus it on things like mass incarceration, and focus it on things like algorithmic bias, and focus it on things like bigotry and exclusion? Because that's the tension.
Right.
Because there's another way to take your resources, to take your Harvard degree, to teach in this space, and look the other way when people are being excluded and pushed aside. And I've seen it, so I'm not making that up. And my point is, in the tradition of Douglass, in the tradition of Du Bois, in the tradition of Ida B. Wells, in the tradition of all of those matriarchs who shaped me when I got to Montgomery, Amelia Boynton Robinson, these kind of people, Johnny Carr, when I moved to Montgomery, she told us we would get dressed up knowing they were going to beat us until we were almost dead. And I put on my best clothes and crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That was the kind of statement I wanted to make. And when you're in the presence of people like that, you appreciate the power of narrative. I just hope we use our skills and resources and our platforms and focus it on the things that help the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, the excluded, not just the celebrated, not just the privileged. And we have celebration and privilege in the African American community too. I think that's the challenge that I'm talking about.
No, I agree. So this campus is having some important conversations right now. And so I cannot not pick the brains of two of the smartest people on the subject of mass incarceration, on the subject of prison divestment. So we've got 20 minutes left, and I want you guys to help us think this through. Let's think it through.
So I was actually just having a conversation about this right before I came to the stage with President Backhow, and I think, the issue is, and the narrative change is a means towards an end, and the end is how are we going to invest our resources? To me, the question is really about investments. What I wanted, what my research shows and what we really have decided to do since the civil rights movement is respond to problems of inequality, and unemployment, and failing schools, and violence with police, and surveillance, and incarceration. And that has not worked. That has not helped keep communities safer. Inequality is widening. And so we need a different set of investments. In the era of deindustrialization, right, when domestic manufacturing leaves, the industry of the late 20th and 21st century is the prison industry, is law enforcement, is surveillance, and this has not worked. So to me, the question, and this seems to be, in the back of our conversations over the past 2 days, is really how can we change narratives in order to think about getting resources to people who have been systematically denied resources historically since slavery. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think, why I'm so inspired by Bryan's work, because I think the first step in so much of this in terms of changing our worldview is really having a reckoning with our history and really reckoning with slavery.
Bryan.
With that, I mean, that's certainly my view, but I think part of what I value in your work, and I just want to say this, is that we make the connections, because what's interesting to me about what happens after emancipation, and this is what Skip's documentary does so brilliantly, is that we actually use crime and criminality to maintain that status as feared and rejected. We just replaced the word slave with criminal, which is how we created convict leasing. And that most people don't know anything about convict leasing is part of the problem, because we didn't recognize, we haven't responded the way we're supposed to respond when we saw that rate of incarceration going up in the 1970s and 80s. And so that history, I do think, is really important. I think there's power in that. When you were talking earlier about how we don't know the names of people who were in these spaces, if you ask most Americans to name one African American that was lynched between 1877 and 1950, they can't give you a single name. And that absence of consciousness is part of that problem. So I do think that the money question is critical to the justice question. We went from $6 billion in spending on jails and prisons in 1980 to over $80 billion. That's a conservative estimate. $80 billion. Last year in California, they were putting kids in juvenile facilities. They were spending almost $200,000 a year for each juvenile they put in a juvenile detention facility. And if you imagine what mothers and grandmothers and cousins and fathers and brothers could do, if somebody gave them a quarter of that, said, here's $50,000 to help your child deal with the challenges in your community. We're going to give it to you every year for the next 10 years. It's, for me, it's not hard to see why that wouldn't be a healthier investment in justice. And that's why I don't have any space for defending or justifying or rationalizing investing in prisons or investing in policing or investing, I just don't.
So, I will add to that. I think one of the most important things for us all to register, too, as we think about the policy environment of criminal justice is that I think this is true and fair to say. You'll tell me if it's not. But I think it may be the case, I just qualified my own sort of statement, that the most important thing that's happened for criminal justice reform in this country in the last 15 years is the Great Recession. Because those budget crises forced Texas and California to change direction. We don't want to use a recession to get justice. But I think it does drive home the point that you have to take resources, you have to commit to taking resources out of criminal justice and reinvesting those resources in other areas if you want to see a fundamental change. And I would put one other interesting narrative change on the table for people to think about. We forget that economics is full of narratives. So it's a discipline. Sarah, next time, economics got to be on the stage too, okay? And we got to talk about their narratives. And so there's this terrific economist at Stanford who has thought about university budgets. And she makes the argument that every single part of the university budget should be an investment in the thing you're doing, research and education. Now, that's interesting, because if you try to think about investment kind of underneath the penumbra of that idea, right, then you have to ask yourself, when are my investments over here undermining my investments over here? And if I'm investing lots of money in trying to recruit a really broad swath of students, and if my pool of African American males is drying up because over here I'm investing in the stuff that dries up that pool, it doesn't make sense. So I'm just citing an economist there. I want you to note. All right, I'm going to push back though. So now I'm changing roles.
Please.
But how is this issue different from any other political issue that might be on the table that a university might be asked to stop investing in? And then where does it end? And how can we make any sense? So yes, apartheid and tobacco, we understand that that's clear, bright lines, but this is not a bright line. I disagree.
You want to? I do think that the university, that if we're going to solve this problem of mass incarceration, it's going to take all of us. Everybody in this room is complicit in this problem in some way. And it's not going to be undone by, and it's not going to happen by the goodness of policymakers' heart. It's going to take all of us to rethink our priorities. I think that the institutions of higher education can address this issue in two ways. We educate people so we can, and a lot of my inspiration in this thinking has come from your work on education and inequality, Danielle. We have a responsibility to educate, and people who are in prison, the greatest predictor of future incarceration is not race, but is tied to education. If you're a white man without a high school diploma, you are much more likely to go to prison than a black man with a high school diploma. So the people in prison are the most systematically undereducated people in our society. And I think that in this sense, incarceration presents us an opportunity to provide educational access to people who have not had that for a number of different structural reasons throughout their lives. So as institutions of education, I think that we can help expand educational opportunities. And then, of course, as institutions of research, we can bring scholars working with incarcerated populations and communities to address these problems. I think, more than what the university, the investments of the university, we can make different kinds of investments and decide to step up to address some of these issues. And I think it's not just universities that need to do that. If we want to not be home to the largest prison system in the planet, it's going to take
history.
It's going to take universities doing it. It's going to take the banks. J.P. Morgan Chase just divested from private prisons. It's going to take institutions rethinking what their priorities are. And it's, this is not a problem that any one sector or any single policy is going to completely solve on its own.
I also think it's just really important to talk about the morality. I mean, we talk about veritas here at this university. That's truth. And it's not true if it's aligned with things that are immoral and unjust and oppressive. And I think we should aspire to be moral. I mean, let's face it, slavery was profitable to slave owners and those who exploited human beings in the way that they did. They always had an economic justification for abusing people. The 6 million people who fled the American South during the first half of the 20th century allowed the terrorists who terrorized them from the lands that they owned to profit from their fear and insecurity. There was something profitable about keeping black people from voting. You could actually pass laws that empowered wealthy elites throughout that time. It's never sufficient to say, is the economic return for this investment going to be positive if we make the investment? There's another question you have to ask, and that is it right? And it's not right. It's just not. I mean, I studied at the law school, I studied at the Kennedy School. I think I was taught that you're supposed to ask the question, is it right? We've got the highest rate of incarceration in the world, 6 million people on probation and parole, 70 million people in this country with criminal arrest histories, which means that they can't get jobs sometimes and can't get loans. Women, rate of incarceration going through the roof. 70% of whom are single parents with minor children at home. It's not right. And so I think the question is, after you ask, is it right? And I think the answer is obvious. Are we going to lead? Does truth mean leadership? Does veritas mean leadership? I think it does. And this institution has led in extraordinary ways. I want to pat it on the back. There were civil rights acts that came out of this institution, W.E.B. Du Bois that you mentioned. We have led when the need for leadership has arisen. And I just think this is one of those times when we need leadership.
I will give you an example of leadership. Whenever I am in this space, I always like to point out that there pale male over there wrote the first abolitionist pamphlet in the colonies in the 1760s. Okay? So I was also thinking when we looked at Hank Willis Thomas's presentation and he took All Lives Matter and turned it to All Lives Matter, you drop one more L, you get Allies Matter. Allies matter. And this place can lead and knows how to lead.
Yes, when it wants to.
So, yes, I agree. Now, okay, so you've helped us.
Yes. Yes. I just have to say, I like that, Dan. You just slid that one right in there, but I'm feeling it.
I like nodding along. Anyway. Okay, you've helped us with one issue. I would like to get your help with another issue, which connects us back to the previous panel, because we are at a point where criminal justice and technology intersect. And the issue of algorithmic justice could not be more important in the criminal justice sector. And we saw a couple of slides there with sort of the risk assessment for people with arrest records and so forth. So Elizabeth and I are both in conversations, talking to people about reentry, how to facilitate increased reentry and so forth. Everybody wants to rely on algorithmic decision-making to support this. We know exactly the way in which it reproduces underlying patterns of racial disparities and so forth. So here we are again, yet another place where the quantum discrimination, and in this case quite literal, quantum sort of algorithmically defined discrimination is baked into the process, is normalized, is accepted. How do we break that?
I think we have to start by acknowledging there are no shortcuts. It's taken us, 50, 60 years to kind of build this kind of infrastructure of over-incarceration that we're living in. And I think people keep looking for quick fixes. They look for these kind of drive-by solutions. And I just think we have to push back against that. There's a whole hierarchy of values and norms that have supported and sustained over-incarceration, policing, menacing of communities of color, and we have to take those apart. And I think we should be very, very skeptical when somebody says, oh, if we do this, the problem will be solved. And I think the predictions around human behavior are inherently problematic in the criminal justice space. I mean, I do this with kids, so I represent a lot of children. And if you look at the lives of some of my clients and the abuse and the trauma and the suffering that they have lived through, I tell the story about a 14-year-old I represented who was living in a house where his mom was the target of a lot of domestic violence. This boy's mother came home one day, or the mother's boyfriend would start drinking, and then he'd get violent. The man came home one day, punched the boy's mother. She fell on the floor. She was unconscious and bleeding. The little boy tried to help his mom. He couldn't get her to revive. He thought his mom was dead. The man went into a bedroom. The little boy went into the bedroom. He was going to call the police, but he remembered he had a handgun, the man did, in a drawer, pulled out the gun, walked over to where the man was sleeping, pointed the gun at the man's head, and the man was snoring. When the man stopped snoring and jumped, the little boy jumped, and he ended up shooting the man in the head, killing him. Tragic. Tiny little boy, under 5 feet tall, under 100 pounds, 14 years of age. He was probably the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile. No prior juvenile adjudications, no prior criminal histories, except for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because it was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. Wow. So the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult. And they put him in an adult jail. Oh, God. And he'd been there 3 days. I went to the jail to see him. When he came out, he was just terrified. And I asked him questions. He wouldn't answer any of my questions. I put my pen down. I walked around the table. I got close to him. I said, come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me. He wouldn't say a word. And I couldn't figure out what to do. And so at some point, I just leaned on him. And when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him, and he began crying. And then he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. And he told me on the first night several men had hurt him. Then he told me on the next night several people had raped him. Then he told me the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him, he couldn't remember how many there had been. And I held that little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And when I tried to leave, the little boy grabbed me by the arm and said, please, please don't go. Don't go. I said, no, it's okay. I'm going to get you out of here. And I left the jail. And of course, the question I had in my mind, who's responsible for this? And the answer is we are. But the point of this story is if you try to assess what the likelihood of recovery and success for that young man is, we don't have the data necessary to actually predict what happens. We got that little boy out of that place that day. Some amazing people, these beautiful mothers and grandmothers, kind of people I grew up with, wrapped their arms around this little boy. And we got him out, and he did this thing that he hadn't done before. He actually felt safe. And that little boy graduated from high school. Then he graduated from college. Then he got a master's degree in engineering. And now he has this beautiful family of 2 children, this wonderful wife. He calls me every month and he says, Mr. Bryan, I just want you to know I'm doing okay. Oh. And for me, if you don't have that narrative in your head, you can't actually create the data set you need to do the kind of predictive work that some of these folks are saying they can do. And that's why we should do what we can with what we have. But there's a whole lot about redemption. There's a whole lot about recovery. There's a whole lot about restoration. There's a whole lot about love in the African American community and other communities of color that defies any kind of restriction, constraint, or definition. And it does. You know. And until we understand that, we should stop thinking that we can predict who's going to fail and who's not going to fail.
Well, the question itself is the wrong question, because you can take that data and say that what it's showing you is the degree of difficulty. And Joy, this is for you. Degree of difficulty. All right? Because what that means is if you take it that way, then what it's helping you answer is the question of what help does this person need?
Exactly.
If your question is, how can I help this person? You can actually use the same data, and you'll get a completely different policy result. So for me, that means it does go back to this conjunction of morality with narratives, and that issue of beautiful questions. It's, how can I help? Why did we lose that question? So, final thoughts, Elizabeth?
Well, just, on that note, it makes me think of one of the organizations that I'm most inspired by right now. It's an organization called Advance Peace, and it was started by a man named Devon Bogan, and it's beginning to expand, and it's operating right now in Richmond, California, and Stockton, California, where I've been doing a lot of research the past few years, and in Sacramento. And this is an approach to mentoring mostly young men of color who are at risk of shooting somebody else, dying of gun violence, or going to prison. And when these young men make mistakes or in the program, and the counselors who are involved are formerly incarcerated, and many of them are former gang members, the philosophy is they're not kicked out of the program. If they're making mistakes, that means they need more love. And so, I think what they're trying to do is change narratives and give love to people who need love, and using that as a response instead of you're messing up, so let's lock you away in a cage. So I think that we need to infuse these narratives with a love of one another and a different kind of set of understandings and approaches to responding to what I see as the most pressing problems that we're facing right now as a society.
And final thought.
Well, I'm just grateful that there are people, there are historians like Elizabeth Hinton who are trying to tell the story in a new way that pushes us to see past those barriers. There are economists and political theorists like you unmasking the way, in a lot of ways, these structures and systems have conspired to create these conditions. I'm energized by this event, by this conference. I'm just so grateful to Sarah for bringing together these amazing people who use their talent and ability, because ultimately, that's what allows us to be inspired. And I don't think we're going to be able to overcome mass incarceration without some inspiration. I tell people this all the time. You have to be willing to believe things you haven't seen to create justice. There's no other way to do it. I talk about my grandmother a lot. My grandmother was this amazing person who had this ability to inspire you to believe things you haven't seen. And I think that's what we have to do collectively. And when it comes to people coming out of jails and prisons, when it comes to people who have been incarcerated, it comes to their family members who have been burdened by that, I just want to put a plug in for finding ways to embrace these communities and people. When I was a little boy, my grandmother did this thing where she started coming up to me and she'd give me these hugs, and she'd squeeze me so tightly I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then so I learned, and then she'd ask me an hour later, she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. And so by the time I was 10, my grandmother had trained me, she had taught me, and every time I would see her, I'd say, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she'd smile this smile, but I didn't understand what she was doing until I was much, much, much older. She worked as a domestic her whole life. And when she got into her 90s, she fell and she broke her hip. And then she was diagnosed with cancer. And I was in college, and she was dying. And I went to go see her. She was on her deathbed, and it was so hard for me. I was just pouring my heart out, just pouring my heart out. I was holding her hand. Her eyes were closed. I wasn't even sure she could hear me. And then it was time for me to leave, and I stood up to leave. And then my grandmother opened her eyes, and she squeezed my hand, and then she looked at me, and the last thing she said to me, she said, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I'm always going to be hugging you." And I say that to my clients, and we collectively have to say it to people who have fallen down and who are vulnerable, because I think that affirmation, that witness, is the way we restore dignity. It's the way we affirm humanity. And when our artists and our talented people and our gifted people and educated people, all of these folks find ways to get closer to this community that has been stigmatized and demonized, and we embrace them, we do something really important to create a new kind of architecture, a new kind of infrastructure for a future that I think is going to really depend on, yes, our best knowledge, our best insight, our best technology, our best judgment, but also our best generosity, our best gift, our best love, to help people recover from something so devastating as what we're living through right now. Yeah.
So, love overrules.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
I do want to take a minute to think about what we've just seen, which was incredible. And while I'm doing that, I'll just give an announcement as you settle back into your seats. I'm Vincent Brown. I teach here in the History Department and the Department of African and African American Studies. And I wanted to let you know that whether you are coming back to Sanders for the evening session or making your way home after enjoying the morning and afternoon with us, we hope you'll attend the grand opening of Gordon Parks, selections from the Dean Collection at the Ethelbert Cooper Gallery of African and African American Art at the Hudson Center. That exhibition showcases a part of the collection of Kasim Dean and Alicia Keys, who hold the largest private assemblage of works by Gordon Parks, spanning the entirety of his career. The reception, like the gallery, is free and open to the public and will run until 7:30 tonight, located at 102 Mount Auburn Street in Harvard Square. And the exhibition will run through July 19th, but we hope you'll attend the opening of it tonight, inspired by the many thought-provoking moments we've shared today and yesterday. So this has really been something else. That last panel, but really the entire last day and a half. It's been informative, empowering, and at least for me, deeply moving, and I know for many of you as well. I want to add my voice to the chorus of praise for Sarah Lewis, whose vision brought us all together. So it's been a long day, but it's been such an amazing event that I don't really want it to end. And happily, there is more to come this evening. But it's fallen on me now to try and offer some concluding remarks. I couldn't possibly summarize what we've experienced together this last day and a half, so I won't try. But let me instead offer a variation on the themes of this convening. A comment meant to be more of a provocation than a conclusion. And here I'm going to break the rules a bit and end with something of a seminar discussion, if you'll forgive me, Sarah. One of the things I've most enjoyed about this gathering is the way it has turned our attention to the two senses of vision, to look and to imagine, and asked us to employ both in our estimation of justice. Can we imagine justice by seeing it? How would we recognize it if we did? In their own ways, each of the panels and performances has taught us the need to imagine what justice might look like, or sound like, or move like, to envision ourselves in justice, as young Amanda Gorman said. But what would that justice even be? Equal citizenship under state law? A confident sense of belonging? To what? And with whom? So much of our discussion has revolved around the simple right to live and thrive, and to see that right manifested and reflected in the world around us. But racism is so blinding. And here my own work leads me to think about things in a way that might at first seem peculiar. I'm not an artist or an art historian. I'm primarily a historian of slavery and war. I've recently written a book about the largest slave rebellion in the 18th century British Empire, Tacky's Revolt in Jamaica, which convulsed Britain's most profitable and important colony in 1760. Writing that book has taught me to think of the relationship between slavery, racism, and war in ways that I think are relevant to our discussion, though perhaps in a roundabout manner, so I hope you'll bear with me. We generally acknowledge that racism emerges from the history of slavery, but seldom consider that slavery had its roots in conquest and the desire to perpetuate the fruits of conquest through the violent domination of the conquered. The former slave, abolitionist, and war veteran Gustavus Vasa, who many of you know as Lauda Equiano from his late 18th century autobiography, famously defined slavery itself as a perpetual state of war. This was not war in the conventional sense between distinct armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, mastery was, by nature, a forceful collective assault. The racism that attended, supported, and outlived Atlantic slavery is a species of war as well. So I want to suggest that among slavery's most important legacies is the fact that racism's primary evil is less the dehumanization of black people than it is anti-black militarism. Its most dangerous manifestation is not exclusion, but the will to domination that treats black people not just as outsiders, but as enemies. Sarah Lewis talked about how pictures could be weapons. I want to think about what it would mean to take that literally. When she asked me to participate in this event, my first thought was to remember that I had once been the target of a kind of racist portraiture. While living in my hometown, San Diego, in 1990, I was thought to match the artist's composite sketch of a serial rapist and murderer, the so-called Claremont Killer. The picture accompanied a description: a black or Latino male, 5'8" to 6'2", aged 18 to 35. The police had me down to the station for fingerprints and a DNA test, along with nearly 800 other black and brown men that looked nothing like me. As it turns out, this was the first DNA dragnet in US history. The artist's sketch, the wanted poster, targeted a population of hundreds. This is not the kind of portrait we usually think about when we talk about culture. At this convening, we've mostly considered culture as the expressive works of the imagination. When I consider the work of that wanted poster, though, a target for an enemy population, I think more of culture as a system of meaning organized by our sensory perception. The words and images that tell us what makes sense, what to care about, what to fear, or who we should hate. The portrait of a black man as a target does a similar kind of work, then, to a flag, organizing a sense of belonging and purpose, and marking distinction between citizen and alien. A wanted portrait marks a target in the way facial recognition software does, or digital imaging more generally, which has become vital to the conduct of modern warfare. Now, I may be personally primed to think this way. I grew up in San Diego, California, one of the most potent military garrisons in the history of the world. Born at the height of the Vietnam War, raised during the Cold War, and entering adulthood during the Gulf War, I witnessed the flowering of American militarism and have never been convinced that all our battlefields were overseas. As we near the end of the second decade of continuous terror wars, I cannot say that I have ever truly known peace, even though I've never been a soldier. Recently, after a conversation with the current US president, former President Jimmy Carter told a church congregation in Plains, Georgia, that the United States is the most warlike nation in the history of the world. This country, he said, has only enjoyed 16 years of peace in its 242-year history. What does it mean to talk about justice, belonging, and inclusion in a country that has been perpetually at war abroad, even as the conquest and domination of those outside the circle of protection at home endures? Jelani Cobb was absolutely correct yesterday to note that the history of citizenship in the US embodies a racial narrative, but it is therefore also a militarized concept. How else can we understand the history of violence, constant and relentless violence, that Carrie Mae Weems mourns in her devastating Grace Notes? Why else would there have been an escalation of the killing of young black men during the Obama years? How else could a state government get away with poisoning an American city? Doesn't our culture of war help to explain how a black man can reach for a wallet and a cop can literally see him pulling a gun? This is the image that art must disarm if we are ever to envision ourselves in justice. Counter-narratives, whether in pictures, music, performance, design, writing, or the creative improvisations of everyday life, can set a mood of peace, out of which a system of peace can be built, as called for by one of America's most strident anti-war activists, Martin Luther King Jr. Racial injustice around the world, poverty, war. When humankind solves these three great problems, Dr. King said, we will have learned the practical art of living in harmony. As Dean Larry Bobo reminded us yesterday, we are not yet saved. And there can be no truly redemptive movement for justice without a movement to change our warlike culture, the system of meaning that demands that we conquer and dominate and kill. No peace, no justice. This profoundly illuminating convening has made that clear to me. So I want to give a final thanks to Sarah Lewis, our hosts and our sponsors, and to all of you. This has been a truly transformative event, and I'm confident that it carries forward the work of envisioning justice for all. Thank you.